Are you also tired of one-size-fits-all weight loss plans? Meet Noom, the personalized solution that meets you where you are. Noom is able to understand your unique needs, from dietary restrictions to medical concerns. Unlike restrictive programs, Noom embraces your lifestyle and choices. Discover a sustainable approach to weight loss, tailored just for you. Honestly, Noom felt like it was made for me. It's not just about what I eat, it's about understanding why. With Noom, I've learned so much about myself and built healthier habits that stick. It's all about progress, not perfection. Say goodbye to restrictive diets and experience the Noom app for yourself with personalized lessons and expert coaching. Noom's psychology and biology-based approach has helped over 5.2 million people achieve their goals. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold. Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and this is a novel episode. We are discussing Elephants Can Remember. My good friend Mark Aldridge will be joining later on in the episode. But first, before we get to Elephants Can Remember, I have some housekeeping, or perhaps I should say mailbag business to attend to, because this is the portion of the episode where I get to share some of the messages all of you sent to me. So first up is horse abuse. That's right, horse abuse. Many of you pointed out that there was a pretty obvious answer to my bemusement as to this detail we got in Nemesis of Miss Marple mentioning how the youths these days were doing such crazy, crazy things like putting horses' eyes out. On the episode, I was like, what on earth is that about? And many of you responded with, it's Equus, duh. Actually, you were all much nicer than that. You very kindly pointed out that this is the same outrage committed in that oh-so-modern 1973 play by Peter Shaffer, who incidentally is the identical twin brother of Antony Shaffer, who wrote the Ustinov Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun adaptations, among such other gems as Sleuth, which Catherine and I covered on a Patreon episode. That is not the last time that we will be discussing identical twins in this episode, I'm sad to say. But even given that explanation as to Equus, there's still an extra wrinkle here because Nemesis was published in 1971, whereas Equus was neither written nor performed till 1973. So what gives? Well, I hate to have to tell you this, but Peter Shaffer was inspired by a real life event that took place in 1971, maybe in Suffolk, where a young man, maybe a stable hand, used a spike of some sort to blind maybe 6, maybe as many as 26 horses. Yikes. So there you go. Christie must have heard about the same event and put it in her book. A very strange tie that binds Nemesis and Equus, but I thought you would all appreciate that. All right, next item, we have to discuss the question of whether or not Poirot is in fact Flemish. And since we're about to immerse ourselves in the world of Poirot once more, I figured we might as well take a little time considering this question, which I posed in the short story episode for Double Sin. And I mentioned that in that story, Hastings talks about Poirot exhibiting a characteristic Flemish thrift, which led me to wonder whether the obviously French-speaking Poirot, who is of course Belgian, could in fact be Flemish. And as I hoped, I heard back from some listeners about this, 2 listeners to be exact. First First up, we have this from a listener who is both Belgian and Flemish. Your research is correct. Flanders, aka the Flemish region of Belgium, is the Dutch-speaking community to the north of the country, while in Wallonia, or Walloon region to the south, the majority speaks French. There's also a tiny German-speaking community, but let's not go into that level of detail. And then the listener inserted a winky smiley face. Then there is the case of Brussels, where Poirot made his career as a policeman. Historically, it was a Dutch-speaking city, but when Belgium gained independence in 1830, Brussels became the capital and as such the seat of power that was overwhelmingly Francophone. Dutch wasn't even recognized as an official language in Belgium until 1898. For perspective, that's 5 years after the events of the chocolate box. And so, even in the northern cities of Flanders, French established itself as the language of the nobility and the bourgeoisie, while Dutch was considered the language of the lower class. This continued well into the second half of the 20th century, so it is indeed possible and even probable that someone of a, let's say, upper middle class background in that time would speak French, even though they might be culturally Flemish. Now, some fictional biographies of Poirot I read online seem to note his place of birth as Spa, which is indeed a small Walloon town and thus culturally as well as linguistically French, but it's still close to the Flemish border, so who knows what exactly his background may be, even going back a generation. I'm still quoting from this listener here, by the way. This is all him, not me. I love how deeply he dove here into this question. Continuing on. As an aside, the thrift Christie ascribes to the Flemish character is something generally more considered a stereotypical trait of the people of Holland, which is a different country entirely. I could see where Agatha was coming from, though, as the quote-unquote Germanic Flemish are sometimes characterized as more pragmatic and sober than the quote-unquote Latin Walloons, who have a reputation of being more sanguine and bon vivant. If you wanted to position the uptight and fastidious Poirot on that scale of Belgianness, I kind of understand how she could have landed on the side of Flemish. Much of this is pure conjecture on my part, though, and you should know that none of these so-called cultural or linguistic traits or differences are rooted in any kind of objective fact. Knowing Agatha's sometimes loose relationship with research and continuity, they might simply be a reflection of her own preconceived notions about a foreign country, speaking as a British person in the 20s. I hope this has been a little enlightening for you. And indeed it has, listener. Thank you so much for that. And now the second listener, who lives in Brussels, took more of a historical perspective, which I also found really interesting. Flemish speakers have always been substantially more numerous than French speakers among the Belgians ever since the creation of the country. But the elite of the new country at the time of its creation was very much French-speaking, and the national government and cultural institutions were fully French-speaking to start with. Flemish was seen as something for uneducated peasants. Especially here in Brussels, where ordinary people originally spoke a local Dutch/Flemish dialect, there was a gradual shift in language use, as parents encouraged children to learn French in order to get ahead. It was essential if you wanted to go to university or work in the civil service or the legal system. And so Brussels shifted without any population movement, gradually from being largely Dutch-speaking to being largely French-speaking. Many French-speaking Belgians have very Dutch-sounding surnames, but don't speak any or barely any Dutch themselves. It reflects their family origins. I have to say, Poirot is not a name like that, but never mind. Now, I found this next part really interesting. The social and cultural weight of the languages has changed over the years. There was a cultural revival movement in Flanders in the mid-20th century, which pushed for having Dutch-speaking cultural and academic institutions, and then to remake the unitary state as a federal one where the two communities decide most things separately for themselves. These days, it's the north of the country, Flanders, with its high-tech and fashion industries, which is notably richer and more influential than the south, Wallonia, with its legacy of coal mining and heavy industry. A reversal of fortunes, but in the north, they still feel hard done by, a legacy of past condescension. It is a surefire vote winner in Flanders to complain about the money of hardworking, prudent Flemings going to pay for unemployed Walloons. These stereotypes are not fair, but they are part of the national discourse. And here in Brussels, what happened after that was substantial immigration from Arabic-speaking Africa, especially Morocco, and an influx of people from around Europe to work for or try to influence the EU and NATO, which are both headquartered here. I love that I live in a fairly small city, which is super cosmopolitan, where you can never tell what will be the native language of the person next to you on the bus. Thank you so much to both these listeners. This is exactly the response I was hoping to get. I think we've really complicated the question as to whether Poirot is Flemish or Francophone. I don't think that there's a clear answer, and that's fine. But it's really interesting to ask the question and to ponder it, as these two listeners did so excellently. All right. Third item has to do with marron glacé. Oh, yes, that's right. If you remember, I was a little obsessed with the marron glacé that Miss Marple seems to be a little obsessed with herself in Nemesis. These are the confections she dreams about consuming with the money Jason Raphael will give her if she can solve a certain mystery in that book. And of course, she does solve it. So I got this from a French listener. As a French listener, I feel I can give you a little more information on marron glacé that you seemed curious about. It's not very good, I'm afraid. It was the traditional Christmas treat a long time ago, which is why I believe Agatha Christie might have tasted them. You can still find them quite easily around Christmas, but it is more niche. They are incredibly sweet, one might say sickeningly so. Since then, it's been reinvented by many prestigious pâtissiers. The most famous version is from the Parisian bakery Angelina, which created Le Mont Blanc, chestnut paste, meringue, and chantilly. I wouldn't recommend if you have diabetes. And, this actually isn't irrelevant to Elvins Can Remember, which includes 2 separate references to petit fours that I will absolutely be glossing over in my plot summary, because Mrs. Oliver likes her sweets. And of course, her real life counterpart, Agatha Christie, very much liked them too. Christie had an insane sweet tooth. This was the woman who, instead of drinking alcohol, preferred a cup of cream served neat, like others drink their whiskey. And I have to say that also puts Poirot's syrops in a new light. Perhaps this sweet tooth is one of the few characteristics Christie shared with Poirot, who otherwise seems to be pretty much her opposite. Okay, that's all I have on marron glacé. I promise I will stop talking about them from now on. Apparently, my sweet tooth rivals Christie's. My last mailbag topic has to do with general paralysis of the insane. So I had not one, but 2 listeners write in about a point of clarification having to do with a novel we covered a while back. That novel is A Pocketful of Rye. And this doesn't really have anything to do with Elvins Can Remember, but it's really interesting. So here goes. Fast forward if you haven't yet read A Pocketful of Rye. But the first victim in that story was the patriarch of the family, Rex Fortescue, who is a fairly unpleasant business titan, and who in the course of our episode, Catherine and I described as potentially suffering from DPI. So one of these 2 listeners, whose name is Afrina Alam, and who indicated she would love for me to use her name because her family will get a kick out of it. Afrina believes that this is a typo, and what Christie meant was GPI, or general paralysis of the insane. And she is absolutely correct, though to be fair here, Christie actually does use the term GPI. We are the ones who incorrectly referred to it in our episode as DPI, which our other listener pointed out in a separate email, very kindly, I might add. So again, it was not Christie's mistake, it was ours. She did in fact refer to GPI in the text. And now I'm going to quote from Afrina's lovely email. General paralysis of the insane, an old-fashioned term for tertiary or very late-stage syphilis, which features dementia and eventually neurological problems too. This would explain Rex Fortescue's increasingly erratic behavior regarding business decisions, which was noticed with alarm by his sons. Tertiary syphilis can occur many years after initial infection, and patients often appear to have been absolutely well and asymptomatic during most of that time. Nowadays, tertiary syphilis is really rare because not only do we have access to sexual health screening, but more importantly, we might get prescribed penicillin for another infection, for example, a sore throat, and that would often fortuitously be very effective against any lurking syphilis before it becomes tertiary. In those days, penicillin use was probably much less widespread, so tertiary syphilis was much more common. The sexually transmitted nature of syphilis would, I think, at that time have had negative connotations of previous promiscuity or possible unfaithfulness by Rex Fortescue and made him an even less sympathetic character. I think Christie was playing with the idea of possible causes of someone behaving erratically as a possible motive for his sons to murder him in order to preserve the family business. In the end, it was a red herring. And this is especially fascinating because Agatha Christie's own father-in-law, Mr. Archibald Christie Sr., that would be Archie's father, he is on record as having died from general paralysis of the insane. And Catherine and I talked in the Pocketful of Rye episode about how that novel was in many ways an exorcism years after the fact of Christie's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad time in suburban Sunningdale with her first husband, Archie, in the lead up to the dissolution of her first marriage. That was our take anyway. So I think this detail adds a bit of heft and texture to that argument. Just very, very interesting. And by the way, if you couldn't tell, Afrina is herself a doctor. So that is why she was such an expert on GPI. And I appreciate her lending her expertise to this issue. All right. Believe it or not, I am now ready to discuss Elephants Can Remember. This is the point of the episode where if Catherine was here, she would be haranguing me to stop going off on tangents and get to the book that we're supposed to be discussing. So here we are. Elephants Can Remember was first published by Collins Crime Club, but of course in the UK. That was in November of 1972. It was published in the US by Dodd Mead later that same year, and it was serialized in the Toronto newspaper supplement, The Star Weekly Novel, in 2 abridged installments in February 1973. I'd like to talk a little bit about the title. First of all, I think a more accurate title for this book may have been Wigs and Twins and Dog Bites, oh my. But Elephants Can Remember is certainly a more evocative title. One issue that I have with it is that Christie goes to such pains to bring up elephants as much as possible in this book. Even John Curran criticizes her for this. He writes, the elephant motif recurs throughout the book, often in defiance of logic. For example, the reference in the first chapter to Mrs. Burton Cox's teeth. I will mention that reference when we get there. But what drives me really batty is that we almost get the phrase elephants can remember so many times in the novel. Almost, but not quite. So these page numbers refer to my US HarperCollins copy, of course, but I just had to note it as I was reading. And then I made a little list of all the times that Christie almost name checks the title, but does not. So on page 31, we have Elephants Remember. Page 33, the elephants may remember. Page 61, elephants do remember. Page 69, elephants, they always say, remember everything. Page 92, elephants don't forget. That's the old saying. Page 119, she mentioned elephants and that elephants didn't forget. Page 162, elephants remember. I'm basically pulling my hair out at this point. I'm like, can someone please just say elephants can remember? And finally, on page 210, 14 pages from the end of my book, Mrs. Oliver at long last says, elephants can remember. And then she repeats that phrase on the very last page in the book's final line. So we do get there. But in addition to my pedantry, I think what we also need to discuss for a little bit is the meaning behind the phrase itself, because elephants really can remember a great deal. This is something that's been proven. The fact that elephants have amazing recall, not only as to their fellow elephants in their herd. Apparently, they never forget a face despite their bad eyesight, but as to events in their past. They remember droughts. They remember incidents in which they were attacked, et cetera, et cetera. They're really quite intelligent creatures. And it's the matriarch in each herd who builds up all of this social knowledge by way of her memory and uses it to help the herd survive. So that's what we mean when we say elephants can remember. We're talking about the power of memory. And it became very obvious to me as I was rereading this book that it is simply obsessed with the idea of memory. So let's talk for a second about Agatha Christie and memory, because Christie biographer Janet Morgan calls Elephants Can Remember, quote, the last novel Agatha wrote before her powers really declined. But is that really true? So over 10 years ago, there was this fascinating interdisciplinary study done at the University of Toronto. And it was a joint effort between Dr. Ian Lancashire from the English department and the computer scientist, Dr. Graham Hurst. And what they did was to take a selection of Christie's novels over the years and count the numbers of different words, indefinite nouns, and phrases that she used in each book. And I'm now quoting from a 2009 Guardian article about the study. They found that the vocabulary size of the creator of Poirot and Miss Marple decreased sharply as she neared the end of her life by 15 to 30%, while repetition of phrases and indefinite word usage, something, thing, anything, in her novels increased significantly. And then even more interestingly, the most abrupt decline was seen in a novel Christie wrote aged 81, Elephants Can Remember. The book showed, they said, 30% fewer word types than Destination Unknown, which she wrote aged 63, 18% more repeated phrases, and almost 3 times as many indefinite words. Now, I should be clear that Christie was never actually diagnosed with dementia, but even so, Lancashire and Hurst concluded that the changes in Christie's writing weren't consistent with normal aging, but were consistent with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, Dr. Lancashire in particular even theorized that by tweaking the proverb, elephants never forget, for the title of her book, Christie was being defensive about her own declining mental powers. He even pointed out that in the book, the protagonist Ariadne Oliver is unable to solve the mystery herself and that she has to bring in Hercule Poirot. And I'm quoting again now from Dr. Lancashire. It reveals an author responding to something she feels is happening but cannot do anything about. It's almost as if the crime is not the double murder suicide. The crime is dementia. And I think that's sad, but also really perceptive. And I think maybe it explains why Christie chose to title her book with the more hopeful phrase, elephants can remember, rather than something declarative like elephants do remember, or simply elephants never forget. And perhaps it's why it took a while for her to name check the title, because it is a little awkward. It is a little off from what the phrase really is. But I do think that that might be the reason for it. And this book is truly riddled with characters angsting over memory, usually Ariadne Oliver. Plus, we know that memory is something that had been preoccupying Christie for a while now in her later life. As I mentioned in our last novel episode for Nemesis, 5 out of the last 6 books Christie wrote are concerned with crimes in the past, meaning memory is central to the solving of the mystery. And it's not like she didn't do this before. Our top-ranked novel, Five Little Pigs, is concerned with a past crime, of course, as are a few other Christies from earlier in her career. But 5 out of 6 books at the end is quite a run. I think that's really significant. And I think you could even see the theme of one's memory failing beginning to seep into Nemesis, where we saw Miss Marple at the beginning of that novel struggling to remember who Jason Raphael even was when she came across his name. The same thing happens here. Mrs. Oliver doesn't remember her own goddaughter, even when she is supplied with the name Celia Ravenscroft. She can remember the Queen Anne silver strainer she gave Celia as a christening present, but not the girl herself. And there really are a lot more instances of Mrs. Oliver either having trouble remembering things or being obsessed with the very notion of memory. And I want to highlight them now because I'm not going to be highlighting them when I do my plot summary, but I do think that the book's obsession with the failure of memory is the most interesting thing about it. So we have an early reference by Mrs. Oliver to the building where Poirot lives, and she calls it Whitefriars Mansions, adding, I can't quite remember the name of it, but I know where it is. We know, of course, that Poirot lives in Whitehaven Mansions, and it's a distinct possibility that Christie herself couldn't remember the name, so she simply wrote something down and then hedged her bets by having Mrs. Oliver say she couldn't quite remember. Or maybe she just wanted to indicate that Mrs. Oliver's memory wasn't so reliable. Next, we have Poirot wondering how long he and Mrs. Oliver have known each other, to which Mrs. Oliver responds, oh, I don't know. I can never remember what years are, what dates are. You know, I get mixed up. And then at another point in the book, we get this outrageously long reminiscence from Mrs. Oliver as to these random events in her childhood. It truly is one of the longest and oddest tangents in all of Christie. And we know at this point that that is really saying something. And to me, it feels like Christie is being defensive almost by listing all the things she can remember. Bear with me. I'm just going to read this out. There are some people who do remember. In fact, one does remember queer things. I mean, there are a lot of things that I remember very well. They happened. I remember a birthday party I had when I was 5 and a pink cake, a lovely pink cake. It had a sugar bird on it. And I remember the day my canary flew away and I cried. And I remember another day when I went into a field and there was a bull there and somebody said it would gore me. And I was terrified and wanted to run out of the field. Well, I remember that quite well. It was a Tuesday too. I don't know why I should remember it was a Tuesday, but it was a Tuesday. And I remember a wonderful picnic with blackberries. I remember getting pricked terribly, but getting more blackberries than anyone else. It was wonderful. By that time I was 9, I think, but wouldn't even go back as far as that. I mean, I've been to hundreds of weddings in my life, but when I look back on a wedding, there are only 2 that I remember particularly. One where I was a bridesmaid. It took place in the New Forest, I remember, and I can't remember who was there, actually. I think it was a cousin of mine getting married. I didn't know her very well, but she wanted a good many bridesmaids, and, well, I came in handy, I suppose. But I know another wedding. That was a friend of mine in the Navy. He was nearly drowned in a submarine, and then he was saved, and then the girl he was engaged to, her people didn't want her to marry him, but then he did marry her after that, and I was one of her bridesmaids at the marriage. Well, I mean, there's always things you do remember. I see your point, said Poirot. I find it interesting. And I have to admit, I wrote in my margin, I don't. That is just quite a word dump there. And I think representative of the meandering nature of this book. So just 2 other moments of faulty memory I wanted to highlight. Later in the novel, when Mrs. Oliver sits down with the Honorable Julia Carstairs, who is over 70, it's not till Mrs. Oliver speaks that Julia recognizes her. And Christie writes, like many elderly people, Mrs. Carstairs could remember voices better than she did faces. And then there's a moment when the young Celia Ravenscroft is talking about the past, how another character had a son who died and then her husband died. And she just breaks off and blurts out, all these dates are so difficult. And to me, it feels like that is Christie speaking directly to us there. So again, it's not just memory, but the plight of one's memory failing that really comes up over and over again. And I think that's just so interesting and so poignant, given what we can glean both from that textual analysis that Doctors Lancashire and Hurst did in Toronto, but also just from our general sense, I think, of the books and where we know Christie was in her life at this point. I think it's also worth mentioning that no fewer than 4 separate characters in this book are depicted as being slightly deaf. I have to imagine that was something Christie was also struggling with at this point. And then just the last word on that Toronto study, Ian Lancashire turned that study into a book called Forgetful Muses, Reading the Author in the Text, which was published in 2010. And it encompasses much more than the simple correlation he made in the earlier study between word usage and cognitive decline. He actually studies not only the novels of Christie, but also Iris Murdoch, who very infamously suffered from Alzheimer's at the end of her life. There was even an autopsy performed on her brain after her death. The book also touches on authors as far-ranging as James Joyce and Margaret Atwood, and the mystery novelist Ross MacDonald, who had his own struggles with dementia later in life. So this is a really uncomfortable subject. It's a sad one. It can be a depressing one, but I do think it's also an important one as we cover this title and the title that comes next, which is Postern of Fate, where I think Christie's mental decline is on even greater display than in this book. So I just wanted to give the topic its due at the top of the episode. And before I barrel on into our usual breakdown of the novel, I will add just one supratextual note to all of this. This is something I'm getting from John Curran, and it has to do with Christie's notebooks. Now, fast forward a moment if you haven't yet read Crooked House, but it seems that in her notes for Elephants Can Remember, she toyed with the idea of a child murderer being the solution. There are vague allusions to this possibility in the finished novel, but they never really go anywhere. So apparently Christie wrote a note to herself about a character calling on Poirot and asking, quote, about Josephine. And she even puts Crooked House in parentheses just in case we think she might have meant another Josephine. So she clearly meant that Josephine. And that's really strange since Crooked House is not a Poirot novel. John Curran calls the reference odd, and I have to agree. And I have to wonder whether she would have made that mistake in earlier years. So I just want to be clear that when I'm talking about Christie potentially suffering from dementia, I'm not doing that from a place of judging her for it or making fun of her for it or getting any sort of glee out of the difficulties that may have arisen from an author trying to continue writing as her mental faculties were in decline. But I also don't want to shy away from it. And I think it's something that becomes part of the conversation when we talk about these late Christies. And I always want to make sure that I'm doing so sensitively. And as always, I'd love to hear from all of you about it. So if you have any thoughts on, I suppose, what I could call the dementia of it all, when we're talking about the last few books Christie wrote, please drop me a line. I'm sure the topic will be coming up in our next novel episode. So let's talk about our victims. There are 2 of them, Lady Margaret Molly Ravenscroft, née Preston Gray, and her husband, Sir Alistair Ravenscroft, who served in the army and is also often referred to as General Ravenscroft or the General. They are found dead together with gunshots to the head and a gun between them, their bodies lying on a cliffside in the coastal town of Chipping Bartram, which was where they lived, in a house appropriately named Overcliff. The gun was one of 2 that belonged to the general, and it has both his and his wife's fingerprints on it. It's unclear whether this was a homicide-suicide situation in either direction or a double suicide. When did this happen? Well, just as in Nemesis, the dating of the past crime is a bit vague. We get 10 to 12 years ago from one character, 12 years ago from another, and 14 years ago from the police inspector on the case at the time. But then quite late in the book, we're actually shown the epitaph of the gravestone of Molly Ravenscroft, who definitively died in 1960. So given that the publication year is 1972, this would support 12 years. So 12 years it is. Moving right along to our suspects. First up is Celia Ravenscroft, goddaughter of Mrs. Ariadne Oliver and the daughter of Molly and Alistair. She was just a child at the time her parents died, a young teenager or thereabouts. But I think one could argue there's a bit of suspicion thrown on her over the course of the book. I also have to mention the fact that she shares a name with the stand-in for Agatha in her extremely autobiographical Mary Westmacott novel, Unfinished Portrait. The protagonist of that novel was also named named Celia, a name Christie seems to have had a lot of fondness for because it's a Shakespeare name. It comes from As You Like It. And indeed, in the course of this very book, while one character is trying to remember Celia's name, she says, she had a name out of Shakespeare. I remember Rosalind or Celia. Because Rosalind and Celia are cousins and fast friends who very much come as a pair in As You Like It. And given that Christie chose to name her only child Rosalind, I think it's a safe bet that she was a fan of this Shakespeare play. Next up, we have Mrs. Burton Cox, she of the large teeth, who asks Mrs. Oliver in the first place to look into the Ravenscroft's death all those years ago. But why does she care so much? Why indeed? We will get into that. Next up is Desmond Burton Cox. He is the son of Mrs. Burton Cox, who very much wants to marry Celia Ravenscroft, despite the fact that Mommy Dearest doesn't seem to be as keen on the match. We also have Dorothea Dolly Jarrow, née Preston Gray. This is Molly's twin sister, who is said to have suffered from mental illness and to have died accidentally just a few weeks before Molly. There were also whispers of Alistair Ravenscroft having been in love with Dolly before he fell in love with Molly, and perhaps even after. We shall see. Seems like a fertile love triangle-esque ground here for a Christie novel. And then there are a few other characters who aren't really suspects. I'm just going to collectively term them the elephants because these are the people Mrs. Oliver and Poirot visit in their joint quest to dredge up some sort of accurate collective memory as to what the heck happened to the Ravenscrofts 12 years earlier. And Mrs. Oliver insists on calling them the elephants throughout this book. They are the Honorable Julia Carstairs, Mrs. Matcham, Mrs. Buckle, Mrs. Rosenthal, and Dr. Willoughby. And I'm just going to go ahead and put the two governesses who worked for the Ravenscrofts back in the day in this category as well, even though they're slightly more important characters. They would be Mademoiselle Roussel, aka Maddie, and Mademoiselle Mohurat, aka Zélie. And that's really it beyond Mrs. Oliver and Poirot and two police inspectors Poirot confers with from time to time over the course of the novel. We'll get into all of that. For all the chattering and nattering on that takes place in this book, it feels oddly empty to me. The opposite of those Christies from the early and middle years that were filled to bursting with characters and incident. For me, this was a muted and faded version of those earlier books. So on that slightly depressing note, let's get into the world as it appears to be. We open on Ariadne Oliver and how. I have to say, I appreciate the consistency of this character. In the very first paragraph, we're treated to yet another summary of the many hairstyles of Mrs. Oliver. She had tried almost everything in turn. A severe pompadour at one time, then a windswept style where you brushed back your locks to display an intellectual brow. At least she hoped the brow was intellectual. She had tried tightly arranged curls. She had tried a kind of artistic disarray. I found myself being reminded of the point that Jamie Berntal made in our Nemesis episode about how Christie would get annoyed when people would compare her to Miss Marple as opposed to Mrs. Oliver, who she clearly wanted people to compare her to. And I think that's because the comparison is so obviously strategic. It's Christie being self-deprecating, but it's just too obvious for my taste. And perhaps especially in this book, because just as Nemesis opened with Miss Marple musing about matters that clearly occupied Christie's mind, this one opens in much the same way, with Mrs. Oliver musing over the 4 different hats she has in her closet and deciding which one she'll wear to a literary luncheon. Forgive the spoiler, but she goes with, quote, a kind of turban of various layers of contrasting velvets, all of rather becoming pastel shades, which would go with anything. Very 70s chic. She pairs this with a well-cut, thin woolen dress of a delicate puce color. And then she's off to a literary luncheon where she is emphatically not going to give a speech since, like Christie, she has a horror of speechifying. And then we cut to the luncheon itself, which gives Christie an opportunity to wax poetic about the dangers of eating food in public when wearing dentures. And you know I'm going to quote from that now. Nevertheless, when one reached middle age, one had to be careful with meringues. One's teeth, they looked all right. They had the great advantage that they could not ache. They were white and quite agreeable looking, just like the real thing. But it was true enough that they were not real teeth. And teeth that were not real teeth, or so Mrs. Oliver believed, were not really of high-class material. Dogs, she had always understood, had teeth of real ivory, but human beings had teeth merely of bone. Or she supposed if they were false teeth, of plastic. Anyway, the point was that you mustn't get involved in some rather shame-making appearance, which false teeth might lead you into. Lettuce was a difficulty, and salted almonds, and such things as chocolates with hard centers, clinging caramels, and the delicious stickiness and adherence of meringues. With a sigh of satisfaction, she dealt with the final mouthful. It had been a good lunch, a very good lunch. Alrighty then, we are clearly in lax late career Christie storytelling mode here, but let's just sit back and enjoy the leisurely ride, shall we? Because we're still not done with Mrs. Oliver's musings, but fortunately, we now get to what I found to be the most interesting part of this opening section. As she's done so many times before, Christie uses Ariadne Oliver as a way to talk about what it's like to be a writer. You know, she's talked about the writing process before and even about her overall discomfort with being a literary celebrity. And now she talks about what it's like interacting not just with fans, but with fellow writers. So at the lunch itself, Mrs. Oliver sits between two men, one of whom, a poet, doesn't talk about literature at all, the other of whom praises her books for, quote, the right reasons, and therefore Mrs. Oliver had thought favorably of him. I thought that was funny. And then things get really interesting. Buckle up, here comes another long quote. Praise from men, Mrs. Oliver thought to herself, is always acceptable. It was women who gushed. Some of the things that women wrote to her. Really. Not always women, of course. Sometimes emotional young men from very faraway countries. Only last week she had received a fan letter beginning, reading your book, I feel what a noble woman you must be. After reading The Second Goldfish, he had then gone off into an intense kind of literary ecstasy, which was, Mrs. Oliver felt, completely unfitting. She was not unduly modest. She thought the detective stories she wrote were quite good of their kind. Some were not so good, and some were much better than others. But there was no reason, so far as she could see, to make anyone think that she was a noble woman. She was a lucky woman who had established a happy knack of writing what quite a lot of people wanted to read. Wonderful luck that was, Mrs. Oliver thought to herself. I mean, that is about as Christie-ish a summing up of her storied career as I think you can get. So modest, so self-deprecating, and yet so perceptive and so accurate, dare I say. I also love that she references the Ariadne Oliver novel, The Second Goldfish, which she already referenced in Cards on the Table. Technically, it was called The Affair of the Second Goldfish in that book. It was funny then, and it's funny now. She's just such a charming writer, Agatha Christie, even in this late book. So then Mrs. Oliver muses on her inability to answer people who attack her with fulsome praise. And she tells an anecdote about a foreign friend of hers when she was staying at an embassy abroad who told her how she has to have more pride, more bombast. You should say, yes, I write well. I write better than anyone else who writes detective stories. Even if you do not think you do, you ought to say you do. And this is another one of those cases where the anecdote is pretty much lifted verbatim from one of Christie's autobiographical writings. We had that section in Cat Among the Pigeons when Mrs. Upjohn goes on a bus trip to Turkey, which was lifted from Come Tell Me How You Live. And this section is lifted from a late passage in Christie's autobiography, which was published soon after her death. And it reads as follows. We were staying some years ago at the embassy in Vienna when Sir James and Lady Bowker were there, and Elsa Bowker took me seriously to task when reporters had come for an interview. But Agatha, she cried in her delightful foreign voice, I do not understand you. If it were me, I should rejoice. I should be proud. I should say, yes, come and sit down. It is wonderful what I have done. I know it. I am the best detective story writer in the world. Yes, I am proud of the fact. Yes, of course I will tell you, but I am delighted. Ah, yes, I am very clever indeed. If I were you, I should feel clever. I should feel so clever that I could not stop talking about it all the time. I laughed like anything and said, I wish to goodness, Elsa, you and I could change into each other's skins for the next half hour. You would do the interview so beautifully and they would love you for it. But I just am not qualified at all to do things properly if I have to do them in public. So that is also charming. And then at long last, we get into the meat of our story. Mrs. Oliver is accosted by, quote, a large woman, ample proportions, large white champing teeth, what in French could have been called une femme formidable, but who definitely had not only the French variety of being formidable, but the English one of being supremely bossy. This is Mrs. Burton Cox, of course, and Christie is not done describing her teeth. Mrs. Burton Cox dipped a lump of sugar in her coffee and crunched it in a rather carnivorous way, as though it was a bone. Ivory teeth, perhaps, thought Mrs. Oliver vaguely. Ivory? Dogs had ivory, walruses had ivory, and elephants had ivory, of course. Great big tusks of ivory. This is that reference to elephants that John Curran found to be rather a stretch. And if it sounds a bit duplicative of the passage I already read out, you would be correct in your impression that Christie is basically repeating herself here. So the large-toothed Mrs. Burton Cox mentions Mrs. Oliver's goddaughter, Celia Ravenscroft, who is going to marry her son, Desmond, or thinks she is going to marry him, which sounded as ominous to me as it does to Mrs. Oliver, who starts to wonder if Celia had an illegitimate baby or was going to have an illegitimate baby, and whether she, Mrs. Oliver, was supposed to know about it and give details. But in fact, it's much weirder than that. What Mrs. Burton Cox wants to know is, did her mother kill her father, or was it the father who killed the mother? And Mrs. Oliver's response is pretty much what anyone's response would be. Huh? Or alternately,
excuse me? A baking powder?
And then Mrs. Burton Cox goes into the basic details, which I've already supplied to you, and says how no one ever really found out what happened. Apparently, they might have quarreled that day or in the days leading up to the incident. There was talk of another man or possibly another woman, but nothing conclusive. Mrs. Oliver tells Mrs. Burton Cox she has zero information, and Mrs. Burton Cox insists that Mrs. Oliver is the only one who can help her. She writes stories about murder, after all, and she could always ask Celia herself. Mrs. Oliver basically just gets up and runs away from Mrs. Burton Cox at this point. She latches onto a literary friend who offers her a lift, and she goes to Poirot's flat, of course, except he isn't home. So then she calls him, and they make a plan to meet up at 9:00 that night at Poirot's. And we get Poirot calling his manservant George here without the S. That happens in dialogue, which always irks me for its inconsistency, but moving swiftly along. When she does sit down with Poirot, Mrs. Oliver tells him what happened at the lunch, and then she asks, what does it mean? He replies, it would be almost interesting to find out. A statement I have to say I agree with, especially for emphasizing the almost. I jest. But ultimately, Poirot advises Mrs. Oliver to drop it, not to do a thing. And Mrs. Oliver says, well, unfortunately, her curiosity has been roused, and she'll probably go mad if she doesn't have an answer to Mrs. Burton Cox's admittedly odd question, because why would it matter whether the father killed the mother or the mother killed the father? Either way, there would be murderousness in Celia's genes, if that's what Mrs. Burton Cox is going for. And this is actually a really intriguing hook. I would say, aside from the textual and subtextual preoccupation with memory, it's by far the best thing about this book. It's a callback to those Christie-ish hooks at the beginning of her novels, where she really does manage to ask an interesting question or pose an outlandish scenario, and you just have no idea how she's going to get to the other side of it and provide a satisfying answer. Whether Christie delivers a satisfying answer to this intriguing question is another matter, but we will get there. So Poirot says, well, if she is going to insist on looking into this matter, he does have a guy who can get information for him. We all know who that is at this point. Polish up the inanimate objects in your room, Poirot, because Mr. Goby is going to be staring at them while he gives you an info dump at some point later on in this novel. I think that's pretty much a certainty. Mrs. Oliver is going to do exactly what she told Mrs. Burton Cox she would not, i.e. see Celia and ask her what she knows about her parents' death. And then she's going to ferret out the people who were around at the time of the incident and ask them what they might remember. And she terms these people elephants because I'm not sure if you've heard this before, but elephants can remember, don't you know? So with this dubious beginning, we enter the investigative portion of the novel. Mrs. Oliver does learn from Celia directly that the following people were at the house when her parents died. A housekeeper, elderly, rather blind and rather deaf, a foreign girl, an au pair girl. She'd been my governess once, Cecilia. And there was an aunt whom I never loved much. We also learn that no one profited from Celia's parents' death except for her and her brother Edward, who was 4 years younger than her and who, like her, was away at school at the time. Spoiler, but Edward never really figures into the story. Poirot, meanwhile, hooks back up with Superintendent Spence, who is definitely Christie's preferred Scotland Yard Inspector d'Histoire in these late Poirots. I mean, what's wrong with Inspector Japp, Agatha? I feel like she kind of abandoned him. But anyway, Spence in turn hooks up Poirot with Chief Superintendent Garraway, who was the detective on the Ravenscroft's case back when it happened. At the beginning of their conversation, Spence says to Poirot, I thought first that it was unlike you to have this wish to delve in the past. And I was like, are you kidding me? That's all that Poirot does these days. And more to my point, this statement of Spence's is almost immediately belied less than a page later when Garraway observes that Poirot has a penchant for looking into the past. And at this point, they reminisce about not one, not two, but three past Poirot cases. Those would be Five Little Pigs, Halloween Party, and Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And eventually from Garraway, we get a few more details about the Ravenscroft case. The Ravenscrofts were apparently very happily married. There was nothing too bad going on with him health-wise. Garraway says that General Ravenscroft was close on 60. His wife was 35. And he theorizes that if there was any tragedy in their past that caused their deaths, it would have taken place while they were abroad, quote, in Malaya and other places. That's where they lived before resettling in England with their children, at which point they led tranquil and blameless lives. But Garraway never found anything from that past. He also has a list of people who were in the house that day, namely Mrs. Whittaker, who was the elderly cook housekeeper Celia already mentioned. Garraway also specifies that she was rather deaf and slightly blind. He also mentions a former governess to the children and a gardener as well. And now it's time for some elephant interviews with Mrs. Oliver. First up is the Honorable Julia Carstairs, with whom Mrs. Oliver engages in what she thought of in her own mind with vague memories of going to dancing class as a child as the first figure of the Lancers. Advance, retreat, hands out, turn round twice, whirl round, and so on. i.e., she's having a conversational dance with the Honorable Julia Carstairs. And side note, but Christie talks about going to dancing lessons in her youth in her autobiography. There's even a photo of her included as an insert in the book in which she's wearing a Grecian toga with her hair falling in tendrils down either side of her face. It's all very romantic. I like to think that's what Christie was drawing on for that passage here. So the big thing we learned from the Honorable Julia Carstairs is that Molly Ravenscroft used to wear a wig. She, in fact, owned 4 of them. Next up is the elephant Mrs. Matcham, who was a former nanny to many small children, including a young Miss Ariadne. And we actually do get some key information from Mrs. Matcham because she worked out in Malaya for a while, which is where something bad happened to the Ravenscrofts, just as Chief Superintendent Garraway theorized. Specifically, it involved the sister. And Mrs. Matcham isn't sure if this was the wife's sister or the husband's sister, but apparently when this person was a child, she might have thrown a baby into a river, and then she had been in and out of institutions, and she got married at some point. Her husband died. And then it seems while she was staying with the Ravenscrofts in Malaya, she did something to a friend of Celia's who had come over to the house. This is when Celia was still a child. She did something bad, though we don't know exactly what. And then this sister was sent to an institution in England. So that's interesting. Next up, we have Mrs. Buckle, who used to clean the Ravenscrofts' place in Chipping Bartram 3 mornings a week. She wasn't working for them at the time of the incident, but she'd been working for them till a month or 2 before they died. And from her, we get a little more information about those wigs, one with auburn hair and one with little gray curls over her head. And 2, well, not so attractive, but useful for, windy days when you wanted something to put on when it might be raining. Mrs. Matcham also references a sister, specifying that it was Lady Ravenscroft's sister. She says she was a half-sister, I think, something like that. Looked rather like Lady Ravenscroft. According to Mrs. Buckle, this sister was a rather troublesome presence. Mrs. Oliver then rehashes all this with Poirot in an extremely rambling chapter that includes yet another reference to Five Little Pigs. She brings up a number of points we've witnessed her and or the elephant make in her interviews thus far, but then she also brings up other points that seemingly come out of nowhere, which is both frustrating and disorienting. For instance, when the fact that the Ravenscrofts had a dog comes up, Mrs. Oliver says, one of my elephants said the dog was devoted to Lady Ravenscroft, but another one said the dog bit her. We were seemingly with Mrs. Oliver for the duration of her 3 elephant interviews up to this point, and this never came up. It's very weird that the first time it comes up, Mrs. Oliver is telling Poirot. Surely it couldn't be a key bit of information, right? We shall see. Poirot subsequently reconnects with Superintendent Garraway, who confirms that Molly Preston Gray did have a sister, and not just any kind of sister, an identical twin sister. We learned this more than 3/5 of the way through the book, I might add, the fact that we have a twin sister situation going on here. As I mentioned, her name is Dorothea. And Molly and Dolly did everything together, including marrying husbands in the army. Molly married General Ravenscroft, and Dolly married a Captain Jarrow. And like her sister, Dolly had a boy and a girl, but unfortunately, the boy was killed in an accident whereby he hit his head and then fell or was potentially pushed into a pond. And there's a lot of speculation as to whether the boy's sister did it or maybe a neighbor, but many believe it was Dolly who did it, and she went away to an institution afterward. We also learned that Dolly was indeed the aunt who was staying with the Ravenscrofts around the time they died, though she actually died nearly 3 weeks before the Ravenscrofts did. Apparently, she was a sleepwalker and went out on the cliff's edge one night where she lost her footing and fell over, dying instantly. Poirot learned even more about Dolly from a Dr. Willoughby who treated her when she was alive. Actually, Dolly was a patient of Dr. Willoughby's father who studied twins. And tangent alert, but I have to say, this study sounds a lot like the real world study in that documentary, 3 Perfect Strangers, that came out a few years ago, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. It's excellent. But according to Dr. Willoughby, there was a project to follow up the general lives of selected pairs of identical twins, those who were brought up in the same environment, those who through various chances of life were brought up in entirely different environments, to see how alike they remained, how similar the things were that happened to them. 2 sisters, perhaps, or 2 brothers who had hardly spent any of their life together, and yet, in an extraordinary way, the same things seemed to happen to them at the same time. Really? This notion of twins going through parallel experiences simultaneously comes up again. And I have to say, Christie seems to believe, or at least be willing to believe, that this is something that actually happens. It's very odd to me. But in any case, Dr. Willoughby says that Dolly definitely killed her young son in that drowning accident. Then she underwent treatment for some years and was seemingly cured. But when she went to Malaya to visit her twin sister, Molly, one of the neighbor's children was killed. And he believes Dolly did this too, though nothing was ever proved. And this is all lining up with the vague allusions to bad things happening that we've heard other characters tell us. Poirot asks if Molly ever exhibited any of these same issues, and Dr. Willoughby says no. And then he goes on to theorize that while Molly and Dolly started life devoted to each other, they diverged as they grew older, and that perhaps Alistair Ravenscroft was at least partly to blame. And now I'm quoting from the text. General Ravenscroft, as a young subaltern or captain or whatever he was, fell deeply in love, I think, with Dorothea Preston Gray, who was a very beautiful girl. Remember how Chief Superintendent Garraway said that General Ravenscroft was close on 60 and his wife was 35? So how could he be a young subaltern or captain when he fell deeply in love with Dolly, who is, of course, the same age as Molly? I'm not sure why an editor didn't catch this continuity error. It's rather galling. But anyway, the general jumped ship from Dolly to Molly, leaving a bitter and jealous Dolly to pine after her sister's husband. And Poirot theorizes that perhaps Dolly's death wasn't accidental. Maybe she killed herself, and both Molly and Alistair felt responsible for her death given their past history. Perhaps their double suicide was the second and third suicides to take place at Overcliff, and there's really no murder whatsoever to speak of in this story. Could that possibly be? Well, of course not. We're in an Agatha Christie book here, and we have to have some sort of a murder happening. And even though this book isn't a proper puzzle mystery, I've scrounged up as many clues as I possibly could from the morass of elephants and fog that we are provided with here. So here goes. Clue number 1, never underestimate the help. But maybe underestimate the help if they have trouble seeing and or hearing. Mrs. Whittaker, the Ravenscroft's elderly cook housekeeper, is said to have been rather deaf and slightly blind. This is mentioned multiple times. And the deduction is that there must have been some funny business going on with the Ravenscrofts somehow, some sort of impersonation or switcheroo afoot, which Mrs. Whittaker wouldn't have been able to observe as easily as one who could see and or hear well. I think that is actually a fair deduction and a leap that an astute reader could make. Clue number 2, Molly and Dolly are twins. And I have to admit, when Superintendent Garraway tells Poirot, you were quite right about her being one of twin sisters, I wrote, uh-oh, in my margin. Because the deduction is that you don't just slip twins into a murder mystery for no reason. So the impersonation or switcheroo that I just referenced in clue number 1 must have to do with Molly and Dolly being twins and being able to easily impersonate each other. And again, I think that is a leap that a reader could make. Clue number 3, what people seem to be, they usually are. I am quoting Poirot here in this very novel. And that is true, except, of course, when people are not what they seem. But this is our Oprah/Maya Angelou clue, which we like to include from time to time on this podcast.
When people show you who they are, believe them. Yes.
And it's a very sunny version of that clue, because the Ravenscrofts seem to have been a healthy and happy couple, very much in love with each other and leading productive lives. And the deduction here is, well, let's believe that they were in fact happy and that they didn't kill themselves due to some hidden tragedy, or one of them didn't kill the other because of some sort of dalliance or something like that. Let's look beyond the Ravenscrofts' marriage to someone other than the two of them who must have upset their happy life. Could it have been the murderous twin sister living with them? We shall see. Clue number 4, never underestimate dogs. The Ravenscroft's dog didn't like Molly anymore in the weeks leading up to her death. That is what we learned from Mrs. Oliver when she's talking to Poirot, and Poirot brings it up again later on in the novel. So we're put on notice that this is a significant bit of evidence. And the deduction is that dogs are always right because, unlike people, they are not affected by wigs, costumes, and bad lighting. Dogs go by smell. And if Molly no longer smelled like Molly in the weeks leading up to her death, which is why the dog turned on her, that means that Molly was no longer Molly. All right, so we've actually gotten pretty far, I think, to solving this as we get into the world as it actually is. Mrs. Oliver has one more elephant to visit. That would be Mrs. Rosenthal, aka Madam, an old school hairstylist who designed Lady Ravenscroft's wigs for her back in the day. And for once, Mrs. Oliver asks a good question, which is, why did Lady Ravenscroft need 4 wigs? Sure, 2 makes sense to need one while the other is getting serviced, but why 4? And Mrs. Rosenthal tells her that it was only 4 to 6 weeks before the Ravenscrofts died that the 3rd and 4th wigs were even ordered. Also, Molly didn't order them herself. Instead, and now I'm quoting from Mrs. Rosenthal here, a French young lady who was companion to her or something like that came in and ordered the wigs. We also get another description of those wigs. We're told that one had a very pretty gray streak in it, and then there was a party one and one for evening wear and one close cropped with curls. So we've had that curly wig mentioned now twice. And then we get our visit from Mr. Goby. We knew this was coming. In case you were wondering, the inanimate object he chooses to stare at is the electric fire, which is even more inanimate than usual because it's not even turned on at this time of year. It's all so very fabulous. And Mr. Goby gives Poirot the skinny on Mrs. Burton Cox, though I'll note we still never learn her first name. We learn that her first husband died in a car accident and that her only child actually died in another accident shortly after that. But this husband settled a lot of money on a Miss Kathleen Fenn, who he'd been having an affair with, unbeknownst to Mrs. Burton Cox. And Miss Fenn had a child, actually, who she claimed was the son of Mrs. Burton Cox's first husband, though this claim wasn't really verifiable given Miss Fenn's relations with multiple men. But Mrs. Burton Cox agreed to adopt the child, and when Miss Fenn subsequently became a most successful actress and pop singer and made a very large amount of money, Mrs. Burton Cox refused to give the child back, though Mrs. Fenn apparently wanted him back. I very much got the feeling while reading this that we were supposed to be siding with Miss Fenn this whole time, despite the fact that Mrs. Burton Cox is a woman who lost both her husband and her child, and then had her adopted son's biological mother haranguing her to give that child back. More on the weirdness of the way that Mrs. Burton Cox is portrayed in the discussion I'll be having with Mark about depictions stuck in their time, but I just felt I had to mention that. All Miss Fenn could do was settle her considerable fortune on Desmond, which he will inherit when he turns 25. Mrs. Burton Cox, on the other hand, has enough to live on at the moment, but not much more. So she is very much in need of the cash she knows Desmond will inherit shortly. And later, in a conversation with Mrs. Oliver, Poirot further clarifies the situation between Desmond and his adoptive mother. He says, so of course, Mrs. Burton Cox doesn't want him to marry, or only to marry someone that she really approves of, or over whom she might have influence. And this is what seems to be at the heart of Mrs. Burton Cox's request to Mrs. Oliver to look into Celia's past. It's a way to discourage Desmond from marrying the strong-willed Celia. And I will just note, this doesn't really supply a satisfying answer to why she would have wanted to know if it was the mother killing the father or the father killing the mother. Other than as a pretext, I suppose, for keeping Celia's parents' unfortunate past at the forefront of Desmond's mind. I suppose that is an explanation, but I think it's a pretty weak one. And then Poirot is off to Geneva, where he first talks to Mademoiselle Roussel, aka Maddie, governess number 1 in the Ravenscroft household, from whom we learn absolutely nothing new. Then Poirot goes to see governess number 2, Mademoiselle Mohurat, aka Zélie. And Poirot tells Zélie that he is going to put forth his theory to her as to what happened in the lead up to the Ravenscroft's death and on that fateful day. And Zélie says that she will listen. And then we cut to the final chapter of the novel, in which Poirot has summoned Celia and Desmond and Mrs. Oliver and his surprise guest of Zélie to put forth his theory once more in front of all of them, this time with Zélie supporting that theory by way of eyewitness testimony. So here's what went down. Dolly was indeed a bad twin, though the good twin Molly very much loved her. So much so that Molly wanted Dolly around, even though Dolly hated Edward, the Ravenscroft's young son. Remember that Dolly killed her own young son. I guess she had a thing against boys. Apparently, Dolly endangered Edward's life twice, once some kind of tinkering with a car, and once some outburst of violent annoyance. It's very upsetting. So Molly was glad when Edward went back to school, though she shouldn't have been, because this is when Dolly turned on Molly herself. Because it was Molly Ravenscroft who died on that cliff in the weeks leading up to what seemed to be a double suicide. It was not Dolly. Except Molly didn't fall. She was, quote, battered with a rock and stones by her sister Dolly. And Molly did not die instantly. Her death seems to have been quite painful, though she lived long enough for Zélie and her husband to find her and for her to explain what had happened, and crucially, to make them promise that they wouldn't allow her sister Dolly to be arrested or to suffer. So Zélie and the general pretend that Molly's body is Dolly's, and then they pretend that Dolly is Molly, which is easy to do since their housekeeper, Mrs. Whitaker, can't see or hear very well. And they put that wig with curls on Dolly to take the focus away from her face. And then a few weeks later, Alistair goes out with his quote unquote wife and one of his guns, along with the dog, who has known all along that this woman is not Molly, hence the biting. And on the cliffside, Alistair shoots Dolly, the woman who murdered his wife. And it's essentially a mercy killing. And then, because he is now a murderer himself and his beloved wife is already dead, he shoots himself. At this point, Desmond and Celia are, of course, free to start their happy and productive life together. And they're full of so much goodwill that Desmond says if he has some money left over when he comes into his windfall from his biological mother, he will settle it on Mrs. Burt Cox. So I guess everyone wins. We end on a very Papa Poirot-ish note in which Poirot asks Zélie point blank whether she too was in love with Alistair Ravenscroft, and she admits she was. Not that they had a love affair or anything like that. It was very much one-sided, and Zélie was okay with that. She was happy to help him however she could, which is why she played the role she did and why she kept it a secret up until now. Zélie says she's also quite sure that Alistair loved both Molly and Dolly till the end, which is why he did what he did. And it's all very romantic. And then, as she so often does, Christie cuts across this sentimentality with a little dose of common sense. Poirot says to Mrs. Oliver, "We will drive back to London. We must return to everyday life. Forget tragedies and love affairs." And Mrs. Oliver responds, "Elephants can remember, but we are human beings, and mercifully human beings can forget." A fitting ending for this memory-obsessed mystery. The end. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
It is time now to talk adaptations and rankings, which means it is that magic time that I get to bring Mark Aldridge in on the conversation. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I am so happy to be talking yet again with Dr. Mark Aldridge, Associate Professor of Screen Histories at Solent University in Southampton in England, and a self-proclaimed agathologist, aren't we all? His first published work, Agatha Christie on Screen, is an essential reference book for any scholar or devotee of Christie. You've heard me reference it so many times. His second published work, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World, recently came out in paperback. It was also nominated for the Mystery Writers of America's Fancy Schmancy Edgar Award in the critical biographical category. But perhaps most excitingly, Mark is at work on a third book, which I believe is provisionally titled Agatha Christie's Marple, All About Christie's second, and if you ask me, best detective creation, Miss Jane Marple. Mark, first off, welcome and thank you so much for co-hosting this episode. And second, how is the research for this book going? And given that your subtitle for the Poirot book was The Greatest Detective in the World, what on earth are you going to do for the title of this next book?
Hey, Kemper. Thank you for having me back on to talk about Elephants Can Remember. What a treat. The research is going quite well. The agathologist thing, it came from, I think it was in the Times. Somebody referred to something I'd put on Twitter in passing, some sort of diary column, and they called me an agathologist. I was like, wow, that's great. I'm going to take that. So I absolutely stole it from somebody else.
Can I take that too? Because I would love to use that.
Of course you can have it. Yeah, we could have multiple agathologists. Anyway, but yeah, the research is going really well, actually. I just came back. I was at the Christie Archive Trust last week, so the family archive, digging through some very interesting stuff.
Very cool.
One or two things, in fact, more than one or two things that haven't been seen by anybody for 40 years. So that was quite exciting.
Ooh, lovely.
But I'm gonna keep a lid on that for the time being. But some questions might be getting close to being answered. Let's put it that way. The subtitle's tough. Jamie Burnsell on Twitter suggested First Lady of Murder, which is quite nice. Also, I was inspired when he was on your Nemesis podcast that he mentions how Agatha refers to her as gentle and ruthless. I quite like that. I quite like Agatha Christie's Marple, gentle but ruthless. I quite like that too. But I haven't really come to a conclusion yet. I've got a while yet. I haven't written a single word of it. I'm still in research mode. And it's technically not due out until 2025, but I'm hoping to get it done a year early and get it out in 2024. But we'll see. We'll see how I get on.
I have to imagine the research phase is long for a book like that because there's a prodigious amount of research, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really long and it's also the bit that's really fun. So that's the bit that I really enjoy, actually digging through the archives, going through everything. Yeah, and then the writing up is sort of like, oh my God, I've got like thousands and thousands of documents that I need to make a story out of.
There's never a dearth of material where Christie is concerned.
No, there isn't. And until then, you find that one thing that you're like, why is there nothing about this? Mm-hmm. You know, I was just going through the other day and I've got very little about 450 from Paddington, the Miss Marple adaptation. I don't know why. It just happens that the paperwork isn't there. The script, I don't have a copy of. But it will turn up. Things will turn up. But yeah, generally, there's generally plenty of stuff.
That's well. Take your time, even though we're all eagerly awaiting it. But I really, really am looking forward to being able to pour through that book, just as I have your other two encyclopedic tomes. That's fantastic that you're finally turning to Miss Marple. I was really hoping, actually, after the Poirot book, that you would do that. So that's really great. All right. Well, lest this episode break 3 hours, someone referred to these episodes as bumper length, which I think is a nice way of describing them. Let's get into the adaptation, actually, for Elephants Can Remember before we talk about the rankings. Normally, I would have waited until the rankings portion of the episode before bringing in my co-host, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk with you, Mark, about the one English language adaptation we have for this novel, since Catherine and I, after all, have spent the last 5+ years on this podcast using you as a reference for these conversations. So this was the first episode of season/series 13. That's the final run of Poirot adaptations. The episode actually aired on its own in the UK in June 2013, quite soon after production on it wrapped. The other 4 episodes for that final season didn't air till October of the same year. In the US, though, all 5 were aired consecutively for 5 weeks in a row in the summer of 2014 and in a different order. So this was actually the third of those 5 episodes in the US, which is interesting. In his book, Poirot and Me, which I often refer to in this section of the episode, David Suchet says the reason they dropped this episode early is that ITV had realized that the worldwide interest in the 13th and final Poirot series was growing at an extraordinary pace. Basically, the people of the British Isles were rabid for their Poirot, so they threw them a scrap in the form of this episode, which is not to say it's bad. I don't think it's bad at all. I do find it interesting that throughout the run of the series, there have been moments, I think, in which the trajectory of Christie's career career and that of the series itself have been out of whack. We have an early sort of jokey thriller like The Big Four appearing in this final run of episodes, for example, and it feels so different tonally as a result because it's very nostalgic and sort of dour as these later episodes can be. But this is one case where the book and episode are very much aligned. You know, we're toward the end of both, and this is when Christie's career and the series were at their strongest. So even though the story wasn't all that strong, I think people were always going to eat it up anyway. And Suchet actually talks about how they took a break in filming to attend this big television festival that happens every year in Cannes, where 400 television buyers from around the world just feted the Poirot series with speeches and a private dinner. And it was obvious to him how much they truly loved it, not as professionals, but just as TV viewers. So the series by this point had really reached the fabled heights it now sits on. But to bring us back down to earth, I do want to share this memory of Matthew Pritchard's that you, Mark, record in your book, Agatha Christie on Screen. It's about the moment when it became apparent that ITV were truly going to do all or nearly all of the Poirot stories. And Matthew says, I wish I could remember exactly when David's eyes lit up and he thought, do you know, I really might make all these. Then he sort of looked at me and he said, but that would mean we would have to do elephants. And I will note that in Poirot and Me, Suchet calls Christie's story strong, which kind of belies Matthew Pritchard's memory here. But there is I'll call it a politic generosity to Suchet's memories in that memoir that makes me give the edge to Matthew Pritchard on this one. So normally, Mark, I would now start quoting from one or both of your books to get your take. But hey, you're right here. So I'm just going to sit back and ask you, what did you think of this episode?
You know, I wrote an article a few years ago for a website when I was saying about the few adaptations, Agatha Christie adaptations, that I think are better than the original story. And this was sort of top of my list. I think they do a really good job with it. That's not to say there aren't flaws. It's still got this really weird pacing thing about it's a lot of chat. It's almost dreamlike in the way that it sort of gently moves you between things. And there are bits of it. I was rewatching it the other day for this, and I was thinking, I can't really believe that this went out for 2 hours at 9:00 on ITV, you know, our most commercial channel. But that's a sort of indulgence that you can give a series after 25 odd years. So it had earned that. I think that's certainly true. I mean, it does the thing. The most obvious thing, which I'm sure you're going to come to, is that Nick Dear's script absolutely goes, there's not enough story here. And so it adds an extra story, which is absolutely what you're dying for the book to have. Yes. When you think how often, Camper, you've spoken about, you and Catherine, about, you know, that extra last murder that she'll throw in to many of her novels to keep the interest going. And you read Elephants Can Remember and you think, oh, I'd love an extra murder.
Oh my God.
Actually.
Oh, completely. Or the side plots when we complain about her books being overstuffed, or Christie herself would complain about that, you know, rereading Murder at the Vicarage and saying in her autobiography, yeah, it's a little overstuffed. Even Styles, when we reread it for our, you know, revisiting episode that we did live at the festival, I was shocked by how much was going on in there. I secretly love when those books feel overstuffed, actually, because for me, more is more when it comes to Christie. But oh my God, I was desperate for more. And yeah, I agree. I think they made some really smart decisions, or rather Nick Dear did when he was adapting this one.
If I'm going to be critical, which I will,
please.
Why not? The green screen is horrible, absolutely horrible. And I want it put on record that it was horrible when it was transmitted as well. You know, this is not an age thing. This is not, you know, nearly a decade later. It hasn't aged very well. I remember being horrified by how awful it looked, especially those shots right at the beginning of them on the cliff top and coming out of the house and everything. Just thinking, wow, you're really sticking this out on ITV. And actually, when it was first shown, and I wish I had a copy of the first transmission to show you, or even remembered more about it, but unless my memory is completely crazy, there was actually a shot where they'd missed one of the green screen bits. It was through a window, and one of the bits of window, like tiny little sections, had green in it because they missed it in post-production, and it's fixed. Somebody spotted it on transmission.
Right.
And fixed it after that. So the copies you see now don't have it. I mean, maybe I'm going mad and remembering that. But yeah, oh my God, that's really bad. That's really bad.
It's a rare misstep, right? Because the production value of this series is so consistent in a way that, I mean, it's been a revelation to me closely rewatching the Joan Hickson series, how inconsistent actually the production value of that series is, even though the acting, especially of Joan Hickson, is extremely consistent and excellent, and generally all the other characters. But production value, I think, varies. There are better episodes and there are certainly worse episodes or lazier episodes. This series was almost never lazy, but I agree. I think they were almost lulled into this sense in those later episodes with the gauziness and the dreaminess of, it's okay if this doesn't look totally real, because we're kind of going for an effect here and we're being filmic and we're being, we're auteurs at this point. We're not doing what we did in those early seasons when it was so real, right? And so bright and grounded, and the period elements were just in your face, and you felt like you were right there with them. They're not really going for that. And I have been on record now so many times as saying I so much prefer, for a lot of different reasons, those earlier episodes. I think I prefer the look of them as well. And this to me feels like the excesses of those kinds of design decisions that they were making in the later series caught up with them, perhaps in this episode.
And I quite like that. Like I say, it has this dreamlike quality. And obviously, a big part of this novel is that nobody can remember anything. So it sort of follows that we're not necessarily always seeing a literal truth in these flashbacks.
This book exists in a fog, right?
Oh.
So I suppose it's appropriate that the adaptation, to a certain extent, is also in a little bit of a fog.
Yeah, it's very foggy. Foggy's a good word for it.
I would just like to note that Celia Ravenscroft is played by a pre-The Crown Vanessa Kirby. I know she's been in a lot more than The Crown, but I think a lot of people, especially on my side of the pond, might primarily know her from The Crown. One of my favorite things that I picked up on when I was watching, I got from you, Mark, because you have a footnote. Yes, I even read your footnotes in your books. It's actually, I think it was an end note, because I had to go all the way to the back of the book to look it up. And I was like, I'm going to get every piece of information that Mark puts in these books, because you really do. You do stuff your books with lots of information, which is entirely appropriate for your genre. But I believe it's in Agatha Christie's Poirot. You talk about a late stage change that was made in the book to Christie's manuscript, where they replaced references to India with Malaya to reflect the fact that India had not been under British rule for 25 years. Because basically, Christie's referring to characters being in India initially as though they were living in a place that was essentially a colony 20-ish years ago. It's all a little fuzzy, as is everything in this book. And obviously, given that this is written in 1972, that wasn't going to fly, because, India had gained its independence before then. But then interestingly, in this adaptation, they actually turned those references to Malaya back to India, as Christie originally had them, since we're in the 30s now, we're in the late 30s, but that's totally appropriate. And I just found that really interesting. And I wondered if they did that on purpose because it was honoring Christie, or maybe it was just a happy coincidence and they figured it was an easier reference that they could get away with.
That is a good catch, Camper. I didn't notice that. I am sure that is a very happy coincidence. I don't think that they were raiding the family archive to check out these things. I think that I'm probably the only person who sat down with 2 copies of Elephants Can Remember in front of me, comparing them.
You're like, if John Curran was a consultant on it, maybe, but no. or you yourself. That's about it. That's the only way that could happen. And then you mentioned this in your book, I believe in both books actually, but there is an anachronistic little goof in that. Mad. Yeah, we have multiple references to Margaret Ravenscroft wearing a wig because she was sick. The implication being that she had cancer and she was undergoing chemotherapy. And that reference is in the book written in 1972, but of course, chemotherapy did not exist in the 1930s, so they should have excised those references, but they didn't. I was very proud of myself because given that we have this present day murder that takes place, it's actually the murder of Professor Willoughby, right? Who's Dr. Willoughby's father, who is referenced in the book. I mean, there is a section in the book where Dr. Willoughby talks about his famed father and his medical theories as to twins, et cetera, et cetera. So, Nictia really did draw upon something, expand upon something that was 100% in the book, which is always, I think, the best way to do it. The murderer who's revealed, so fast forward if you haven't yet watched the episode, but the murderer who's revealed to have committed that in the present is actually the daughter of the murderous twin, right? And she is avenging her mother's death since her mother was actually murdered. And she's very much American. I think in the first minute that we are introduced to her, she says, "you guys," and some other like very blatant Americanism where I was like, okay, this is one of those Christie American characters. It all fits kind of within the world of Christie, which I appreciated. But then at some point in the episode, she says Z for Z. And I actually picked up on it and I was like, oh, she's the murderer because that's a clue. And I usually don't get those fabricated clues in the Suchet series because they're very clever and they're usually on a par with what Christie is doing. You know, Christie had clues like that littered throughout the canon when Americans would say things that were actually British or vice versa. And it meant that they were lying about who they are. So I was very proud of myself for picking up on that.
Well done, Camper. No, I thought the same actually when I was watching it for the first time. But there is that slight question of like, does that mean that I picked it up correctly, or does that mean that that's just
you've
not
made a mistake?
American, yes, yeah,
right,
yeah. Which gives extra pleasure when you think, oh no, that's right, that all fits together nicely.
They really are that clever. Yes, we won't give them the credit of poring over the old manuscripts for for the sake of the Malaya versus India thing, but we absolutely have to give them credit for that. And then the last thing I'll just note is that the element of Mrs. Burton Cox being Desmond's adoptive mother and wanting his money, you know, that sort of venal motivation that she has is also excised from the adaptation. And I think we'll talk when we get to the rankings and specifically the depictions stuck in their time portion of the rankings. I think there's a little bit of nastiness there, which we've seen so many times before in Christie as to Mrs. Burton Cox being an adoptive mother as opposed to a biological mother. And I think it was very smart and a very obvious decision to just take that element out of the adaptation. So before we get on to the rankings, I should also note that there is a 2007 Thai film called Alone that was received quite well when it came out, which is loosely, and I do mean loosely, inspired by Elephants Can Remember. I have not watched it, but apparently it involves conjoined identical twins. And the switcheroo at the center of Christie's novel really is preserved in the film. But I'm, in full disclosure, getting that from Wikipedia. I have not watched the film, but it sounds intriguing. And apparently it's very good. It was also remade 3 different times in 3 different Indian languages. And there is a Filipino film as well that has some similarities to it, which seems to be inspired by it. So we never cover those as closely as we do the English language adaptations, but I just wanted you all to know that those exist. I do cover non-English language adaptations on the podcast's Patreon account. And the latest episode I just dropped yesterday, in fact, is all about Ms. Ma Nemesis, the Korean language adaptation of many a Miss Marple novel. And I really do get into the weeds of that show. So head on over to Patreon if you want some discourse on the non-English language content out there. Let's move right along to the ranking of this book, which is a bit of a daunting undertaking, of course, because this is going to be a little rough, I think, Mark. I don't think anyone will be surprised that this is not going to be one of the highest ranked Christie novels. I'd like to just start out with some scholarly and critical takes on the book, as I often do. I think the most positive take comes from Christie biographer Janet Morgan. She says, "Elephants Can Remember wandered about. It was nonetheless ingenious, full of forthright and often very funny passages, blunt about the physical deterioration of the old, and endearing in its depiction of the relations between generations." I think this is generous, as are many of the contemporary reviews of the novel, actually, since at this point in 1972, and I'm now quoting from you, Mark, Christie was now critic-proof. But I do think if you read between the lines of some of these reviews, you can pick up on some reservations. Here's The Observer: "A quiet but consistently interesting whodunit with ingenious monozygotic solution. Any young elephant would be proud to have written it." And then
I remember having to look up what monozygotic meant. That's the main thing I remember about that review. I
had to look up monozygotic as well. It means, you know, of or having to do with twins, and specifically identical twins, because monozygotic, of course, is coming from the same zygote as opposed to fraternal twins, which would be dizygotic. So that is a great adjective. I'm going to try to use that as much as I can.
Not a lot.
Hats off to The Observer. Here's The Guardian: "The mystery is thin in, the pleasure lies in renewing acquaintance with old friends. And then I also love this detail, which I'm getting from you, Mark. In Agatha Christie's Poirot, you talk about how the Daily Express cited a personage no less vaunted than the poet laureate of the day, John Betjeman, who on the day of publication was quoted as saying, "I only ever read poetry," and Agatha Christie. Very much in the tradition of T.S. Eliot, right? Though he admitted that he was going to wait for the paperback before reading this latest one, as was his custom. So, as per usual, the book was well received. It sold extremely well. This is when Christie's books always sold well. But now I think we can get into some of the more critical assessments that are a little more removed from the time of publication. And this is where things get more, critical. I think one of the wickedest blurbs that wicked critic Robert Barnard wrote on Christie has to do with Elephants Can Remember. Here's what he said. "Another murder in the past case with nobody able to remember anything clearly, including, alas, the author. At one time, we were told that General Ravenscroft and his wife, the dead pair, were respectively 60 and 35. Later, we are told he had fallen in love with his wife's twin sister as a young man. The murder/suicide is once said to have taken place 10 to 12 years before, elsewhere 15 or 20. Acres of meandering conversations, hundreds of speeches beginning with, well, that sort of thing may happen in life, but one doesn't want to read it." Ouch. I'm not sure the dating of the past crime is actually as all over the place as that, but he's absolutely right on the backstory for Molly and Alistair Ravenscroft being inconsistent. We'll get into it, but it can't be denied that the book isn't tightly written. And then finally, that I wasn't going to neglect John Curran. Here is his take. "If it had been written 20 years earlier, there can be little doubt that the plot would have been developed in a more ingenious fashion. As it is, the book is a series of conversations with little action. And like its successor, Postern of Fate, the chronology of the earlier crimes will not bear close examination, a fault for which the elderly Christie's editors must accept some responsibility." And then Curran reserves a soupçon of praise for the final chapter of the book. He calls it reminiscent of the closing scene in Five Little Pigs, with a group of people gathering at the scene of an earlier tragedy in order to learn the poignant truth. But ultimately, he really does come down pretty hard on it. He says, "Despite showing a glimpse in the final chapter of the Christie of yesteryear, Elephants Can Remember remains a disappointment. Like the books published on either side of it, Nemesis and Postern of Fate, there are too many rambling conversations that give the reader little solid information, but merely repeat what we have already been told. The central idea has possibilities, and there's certainly material for a long, short story." I quite agree. I think my main feeling upon finishing the last page was, well, that would have made a nice, neat little Poirot story in the sketch back in the day.
Yeah.
But a full-length novel, I'm not so sure. As we've already mentioned, there's just not enough there. So, all right, Mark, I will shut up. What do you think? Where do you fall? Is this novel ingenious? Is it a disappointment?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because it's a while since you mentioned that this would be the one. And I think the first thing is that this is the first time that I'd read it without the surrounding context. Like, this is the third time I've read this novel. It's one of the ones I've read least. And the previous two times I'd read it, I was reading it at the end of a run of reading Agatha Christie from the beginning to the end. So it was quite interesting to read it out of context and just sort of think about a random reader going into a bookshop and thinking, that sounds like an interesting Agatha Christie, knowing nothing about it and picking it off the shelf. And I think they'd probably be in for a bit of a surprise. But it's interesting. I mentioned on Twitter that I was going to be speaking about it. And Kate Moss replied and said that it was one of her favourites. Maybe not one of her favourites, certainly said something very positive about it.
I think she said, I saw that and I noted it too. I think she said, like, I love this one.
Oh, I love that.
Like
yeah. Which is, and like, there's stuff in it to love. And I think in terms of it's a bit absolutely, I've said the same about it being a really great short story that's a novel length. That's definitely what we have got here. And in terms of thinking about it for the case of All About Agatha and giving it ratings, I would happily read this book more than I would some of her stuff from the 1920s. Not necessarily because I think it's better, or I think it is better than a couple, but because I felt a real connection reading this with Agatha Christie's honesty about who she is, and especially her Ariadne Oliver stuff. Mm-hmm. There is so much that, and we will come to this, I'm sure, when we talk about series characters, but there is so much honesty in that she is absolutely, for them, talking about Ariadne Oliver as herself, more in this book than I think anywhere else that she does. And so I found it very interesting to read in that sense. In terms of it as a mystery, as a 250-page novel, it's not great. There's lots that there's problem with it, but there's bits of it that are so good. There's some really nice ideas, but it's just so woolly. I mean, you call it foggy. It's the same thing. It's just, you're absolutely crying out for dates and details and for there to be more information about some things. And what I find quite difficult is that on some level, you can understand that it's a book about the fact that people don't really remember it. And so therefore they have to, Ariadne and Poirot have to piece everything together. But when you've got even Ariadne Oliver not really remembering what people have said to her earlier, it just becomes really frustrating. And I was quite surprised reading it this time that we do get a date for the murder, like right towards the end, about 50 pages from the end, I think. We finally get an actual date for when the deaths occurred. It's 1960.
From the gravestones, right?
Yeah, on the gravestones. Yeah. And I was like, why, if you're going to tell us it at some point, why haven't you told us this earlier? And I just can absolutely live with the fact that the other characters are going to be a bit woolly about it and aren't going to remember it that well. But the idea that Poirot wouldn't have had Mr. Goby on the phone in chapter 5 and say, right, can we get some of this pinned down, please? Because, hey, Mr. Goby seems to be able to solve everything himself. I mean, we may as well have just referred it all onto him and we'd have been done after 3 chapters. That's my big issue with it. As a mystery, it has many, many problems. But I sort of enjoy the company that I'm in when I'm reading it much more than, say, The Secret of Chimneys, which I think if you read The Secret of Chimneys, there's really no Agatha in that. That's Agatha writing a book. She's got to write a book and it's done quickly. But for this, it's her. Like, it's unfiltered her. And when we talk about Mrs. Burton Cox in particular, I think we get a really unfiltered idea of the way that Agatha Christie saw people quite often.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, I think 2 points. I think that's such an interesting argument you make about the way that people encounter this book. And I never thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. Even, I mean, when we were just talking about the episode, when David Suchet thought about Elephants Can Remember, it was only within the context of having done almost everything else. And, oh, right, we have to do elephants as well. People tend not to encounter this book on its own merits or as a standalone novel even, right? And in some ways, this is almost the great equalizer, this podcast project, because we're coming at every book in the same way, which is as part of a whole and trying to give it its due. So hopefully we can do a little bit of that as we're ranking this novel. It's not going to be high, but I totally agree with everything you said. I mean, I think when Christie wrote The Secret of Chimneys, that was perhaps someone who was trying to write a book that was going to be popular. And she was writing in a style that was very popular in that specific time, which is part of why it feels so dated. It's also, a lot of the depictions stuck in their time or what mar the read of that book. But this is her. And she certainly knew who she was. And she had her voice and her opinions. And even though that voice was getting woolly or foggy due to perhaps a decline that was happening to her mental faculties, I think that is interesting. And that's something to be valued. And it probably goes most to series long characters because we have her fictional counterpart, Ariadne Oliver here. I think there's a lot to delight in, as there so often is with Mrs. Oliver on the page. I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but I think a lot of people who are Christie fans, when they think of Elephants Can Remember, they cite this study that was done over 10 years ago at this point, in which Elephants Can Remember was one of the central texts used to prove that it seems as though Christie were suffering from some form of dementia by this point in her life, because her use of words had decreased. She was using fewer words, and she was also using less declarative and specific words. She would use thing a lot, or something, as opposed to actually finding the proper word for what she was trying to talk about, which is not something that she had done even 10 years before. So in a way, I mean, there's an argument to be made that if you wanted to do a sort of postmodern literary analysis of this book being about the very state of forgetting and having problems with memory, this book almost puts you in the foggy / woolly mindset of its author and the characters who she's molding in her own form, right? And perhaps there's some power there. That is certainly not anything that Christie herself was intending to do. But, authorial intention is only one aspect of how readers encounter a book. So there's something, I think, to be said for that aspect of Elephants Can Remember, even though it certainly does not make it a good mystery. It actually makes it a much more frustrating mystery and a less satisfying mystery than most of the mysteries that Christie wrote. But it's interesting, and we should give the book its due. So moving through our various categories, I think that the plot mechanics and plot credibility categories are going to be two of the lowest ranked, because this is where we really just have to consider the puzzle mystery, right? The puzzle making aspect of this book and what Christie is or isn't doing here. And let's be honest, the puzzle boils down to one twin gets substituted for the other with the aid of a wig, and the fact that the main member of the help in the house can't see very well. And then a dog nearly blows the masquerading twins cover, but doesn't. And that is it. That's it. Those are the only clues. The only clues we get are twins, wig, help who can't see well, dog biting.
Can I talk about two of those clues as well? We were saying before we were recording, Kemper, about how difficult this book is to double check stuff because the language is so vague that sometimes things will come up and you'll be like, has this been mentioned or not? The wigs. What was your feeling about the wigs? Did it all work for you?
I think that there is some fuzziness about it, because my takeaway was that the wig that she ended up wearing was kind of a big wig, right? Like it had curls.
It had curls that came near the face and stuff, weren't there?
So that it
disguised her a bit.
Yes, exactly. It was a misdirect, right? So when she put that wig on, you saw the wig more than the face. But again, she's an identical twin, so that really shouldn't have been that much of an issue.
This whole thing about the twins is super odd in the way that it's introduced, because Ariadne is godmother and doesn't mention for ages that there is a twin. And then it's sort of vague about there having been a sister. And somebody says something about one of the elephants says, I think there is a half sister at some point. Like, who mistakes a half sister for a twin? I found it very strange. And I was sort of searching for when the word twin was actually first used in the book. And it's not until over halfway through.
Yep.
And you're like, if you're talking about people who knew them, including Ariadne, why is this not something that's being mentioned really early on? And of course, the reason why it's not is because it's a massive giveaway. Yep.
I totally agree with you. I think, and this is why twins really should not be used very often in mysteries. And I mean, we have the rules, right? We've made reference on this podcast to Ronald Knox's 10 Commandments. And then there are the 20 rules of detection fiction by S.S. Van Dyne. Both of them include twins in their rules. The 10th of Ronald Knox's 10 Commandments is twin brothers and doubles generally must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. And I think your argument is we're kind of not duly prepared for them. And I think we are. She does mention them. It is a little more than halfway through the book. And then it's peppered in there in the second half of the book. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. I suppose we're somewhat prepared for them, but she does it lightly, because if she did do it as she should probably have, it would just be too obvious.
Yeah, I mean, my problem isn't so much that we're not prepared for them. I felt that she was playing fair with it in that regard, but that it just immediately made you as a reader go, well, that's not how you would talk about it. It doesn't make sense for these characters to not have mentioned it. And especially because I could see how she was playing around with this thing about one of the elephants saying, I think there was a half sister or something, because I know that is one of the things that she uses sometimes, where someone misremembers something that is not quite like a conventional sister, air quotes, in some sort of way. And so I could understand her thinking there. But then just as a reader, you go, but you wouldn't. She's an identical twin. I don't know how many identical twins you know, Kemper. I don't think I know any. And I think I would remember if I met.
And you'd certainly remember, by the way, in 1972, when there were much fewer twins than there are nowadays with an IVF technology, which I do realize IVF does not usually result in identical twins, but actually does increase by a little bit the probability of having identical twins. They're definitely around a little bit more now, but even now, I totally agree. I actually can't think of any truly identical twins who I know personally. And there's no way that anyone would misremember an identical twin sister as, a half sister or something. This is not Five Little Pigs where someone is misremembering the wording unlearning of something that completely changes it in a brilliant way, where you're like, oh my God, it's so believable that that's what you thought it was, but then this is what it actually is. And that's why this is, blah, blah, blah. This is the much cheaper version of that. And it's funny, in the very last episode that I did for Wasp's Nest, I was talking about how Christie does play fast and loose with these rules for her short fiction very often, and how I'm fine with that since she's not asking us to invest much time in a short story. But this is a novel, which probably should have been a short story. And given that we're asked to read over 200 pages, we deserve more than Wigs and Twins. We just do. And I think Christie, at the height of her powers, would have realized that. And she would have been more deft, I think, with the twin cluing. And she would have just populated the book with more misdirects and I think just more intrigue somehow. I do find it amusing that this is the second to last Poirot, right? And we have female twins used quite centrally. And in the second Poirot, which was the murder on the links, we also had female twins figure quite centrally into the plot. Let's never forget that Hastings was married off to one of them. So it's this nice little bookending, if you will, of female twins. The only other time that I could think of that Christie used twins was in the Tommy and Tuppence short story, The Unbreakable Alibi, where it's very jokily done. And she's sort of acknowledging the cheapness of it. It's part of the joke of like, oh my God, it was twins. Apologies if that's spoiling that story for anyone. It doesn't matter. You will still enjoy it if you go out and read it right now. So that's 3 instances of using female twins. I don't think she ever actually used male twins.
Not that I can think of. And I think that Tommy and Tuppence story is the sort of, as you say, it's a bit cheap. It is the sort of thing that when you're saying, oh, don't use twins, I think that's exactly the sort of story that is meant by that. I think, well, I know I don't have a problem with the twins in this, actually, because I think it's legitimate and there's more to it, to working it out than that. It's quite interesting that she's so upfront about her influence here with Silver Blaze, the dog in the nighttime.
Right. I didn't even mention this in my summary, but Christie references the Sherlock Holmes short story, The Adventure of Silver Blaze, by way of the famous clue of the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. It's actually not the first time that Christie has referenced this clue. I believe she did so in Evil Under the Sun, if not elsewhere. A fondness for Sherlock Holmes references was one aspect of her writing that did not change over the years, I'm happy to say. Anyway, this is a bit of a spoiler for the Sherlock Holmes story, but the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime is that the dog did nothing, which Holmes uses to deduce that the stranger who was accused of the crime must in fact be innocent. Rather, someone who the dog knew must have committed the crime, or else the dog would have made noise. And here we have the inverse. The fact that the dog reacted negatively to its supposed owner means that the owner is in fact a stranger to the dog.
She is playing fair so much that it almost is a bit of a shame. Because you say, I was really surprised when I was rereading it, how blatant she makes that connection, because I'm like, wow, you're giving quite a lot away there.
And the dog clue, I actually have no problem with. I mean, it is clever.
No, it's a great clue.
And I think if it was one clever clue among many clever clues, it would be a great piece of a classic Christie. It's just that there isn't enough alongside it, I think, for our satisfaction. I promise I'm almost done talking about twins, but I just had one more point to make. And I think many of you will appreciate this. We know from Christie's notebooks that in addition to the time she actually used twins, she toyed with using twins throughout her career. And while she was working out her plotting for this very novel, she had what I think is a bang up, brilliant idea having to do with twins, which she unfortunately did not use. So I'm getting this from John Curran, of course, specifically his second book about Christie's notebooks, Agatha Christie, Murder in the Making, More Stories and Secrets from Her Notebooks. Here's what she scribbled down. Lalaga and Lorna, identical twins, those are their names, born same day, but really not identical, look quite different, come from Australia or New Zealand. Lalaga plays part of both sisters. Third person in house is Stephanie, really Lorna. Play part of maid or one-time au pair girl, foreign accent, etc. Okay, so let me just translate that. And fast forward if you haven't yet read The Case of the Perfect Maid. But this idea is very similar to what we have there. It's one person pretending to be two people. But the twist, which I think is so brilliant, is that we have a set of twins, legitimate twins, who are actually fraternal twins. So they look nothing alike. And they are pretending to be a set of identical twins with a maid or some sort of a member of the help attached to them. as a third party. So you have one sister being the identical, quote unquote, identical twins, and then the other sister being the maid, and they do something like murderous or whatever as a result of that subterfuge. I just think that's really ingenious. And I would have loved to see Christie write that when she was at the height of her powers.
I have another twin thing to say, which is that a few years ago at the Agatha Christie conference, when it was held at Solent, a very nice lady called Emma Shackle joined us and gave a talk, and she knew Agatha Christie, and she is a twin. And she felt that actually her and her sister had been an influence, perhaps, on Elephants Can Remember. But I won't go into more details than that because it's her own story to tell. But she did know twins in the real world. And so it's possible that they had been an influence on this. But she'd certainly toyed with twins for a long time as well. But I thought that was quite interesting.
That is, well, believe me, if I were that twin, like either of those twins, that would be my sort of opening little fun fact at any cocktail party. I'd be like, did you know that I was the inspiration for the twins in Elephants Can Remember? I am officially off twins now, but I just have one more weirdo conspiracy theory to throw out there as to the central story in Elephants Can Remember. So there was this throwaway reference to the horror novel, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, in the previous novel that we covered in Nemesis. I mentioned this on that episode when I was co-hosting with Jamie Berntal. Miss Marple sees it in the post office, and she's sort of talking about these awful lurid covers with the postmistress, and they're kind of clucking about how inappropriate it is. And I was just thinking, and it was so strange to have Whatever Happened to Baby Jane reference in Agatha Christie novel, which is why it stuck in my brain. And I was just sitting back after I finished Elephants Can Remember and thinking, isn't this plot a little similar to that one? We have two sisters who hate each other and who are each other's downfall in a way, and whose roles in a horrible incident are actually the reverse of what we think they are. I mean, it's a car crash in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And this story, too, does have a touch of horror in it. You know, one of the few moments that I found effective as a reader was when the former governess character, Zélie, she's remembering what Dorothea said in the wake of killing her sister. And she says, I wanted to see the blood, you know. So I don't actually really think that Christie was directly inspired by Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. I realize I'm the first, and I'm pretty sure only person who's ever going to draw a line between Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and this novel, but it just occurred to me, and I wanted to throw that out there.
I think I like that idea. I think that's very good, Campbell. I think that's a perfectly decent suggestion. Yeah, why not? Why not?
Why not? I mean, and Christie was very widely read. I mean, that's the thing. I think people like to pretend that, oh, you know, Christie was such an outlier and did her own things, and she was just this curious little woman who wrote her mysteries, but she read widely and deeply, actually. And I'm sure she did read Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. So, Mark, how would you rank plot mechanics?
Well, mechanics for me is a lot lower than credibility. I don't have as big a problem with credibility as it sounds like you're going to have. Because actually, I think because of the sort of simplicity of this in lots of ways, I'm not too concerned about that. But mechanics. Now, when I was reading it, I started to put these little sort of post-it note marks whenever I thought there was an unnecessary diversion. And I got about 3 chapters in and thought, I'm going to have to stop doing this because I'm putting them on like every paragraph. And so for me, I know that isn't necessarily exactly what mechanics mean, because you're generally talking about the solving of the crime. But the way that it's presented to us in a way that just pushes anything important tantalizingly out of sort of reach is quite frustrating. There are a few really obvious examples of that. You know, early on, that whole thing about Mrs. Oliver selecting hats and then talking about the way her hair is styled, that long discussion about teeth and eating meringues and oh my goodness. So all of that I can sort of forgive because actually it's quite fun, even though she's done much better than this elsewhere, but I sort of enjoyed it anyway. But I thought actually one of the most outrageous attempts to pad out this novel is when she sort of finishes at the dinner or wherever and she says, I'm going to go and see Poirot. And that's the end of the chapter. Then the next chapter opens and we're told Poirot wasn't in. So Mrs. Oliver gives him a call. So she calls him up and says, I've got something interesting to tell you. Can I come and see you? And he says, yes, you can come and see me. And I was reading it going, why? Why didn't we just go straight to her seeing Poirot? And the only reason I could really think was because it gave us an extra couple of pages of something to do. So in terms of us actually moving through the mechanics of the mystery, it feels like we are just constantly being deliberately slowed down so that we don't reach it too quickly, which she very often does, and there's nothing wrong with that in itself, but usually does it in a way that isn't as noticeable. Whereas you're watching this and it's a bit annoying, actually, that we're not being told this or that we haven't got to this point yet. Whereas usually the diversions are a big part of the fun. And actually, very often, they might not be important to the solving of the crime, but it's been fun getting there along the way. So for me, mechanics sort of has to encompass that as well, as the fact that actually moving through this mystery is a bit like wading through treacle. And I do want to say again that obviously I love Agatha Christie and I get great pleasure actually from reading this novel in many ways, but it wouldn't be fair to the rankings to pretend that this is a good example. There's a few times when both Poirot actually and especially Mrs. Oliver will say, oh yes, so-and-so said that. And I'll go back and check, and actually they didn't. And so it's like she sort of thought, and the dog is one example of that. But there's a few examples of that, of where points are made or conclusions are drawn, and I'm not sure we ever had that, actually. That seems to have come from nowhere, which is a bit naughty.
I was going to scold you, Mark, for talking about readability in this category when you started talking about but you actually tied it quite convincingly, I think, to the puzzle itself and why the puzzle just doesn't play in the same way that it normally does in a Christie. So I think all those points are fair, and we'll probably be drawing on them for a lot of these other categories as well. And I totally agree with you about those inconsistencies and just the overall sloppiness. You know, in some of these later career Christies, Catherine and I had talked about how the writing got looser, baggier, what have you. This is almost the next level beyond that, which is sloppy and seemingly nonsensical because of that sloppiness and because of the fact that characters are making references to things that just aren't there. Then there's this detail as to the wigs, and this is probably also where the wigs get a bit woolly. We've got woolly wigs here. There's the idea that people say constantly how the social customs around wigs have changed and how, well, back then people wore wigs a lot more than they do now. And that to me would seem to indicate that the past crime took place like 30 years ago, because did wig wearing customs really change that much in 12 years? I don't think so. And those are the sorts of inconsistencies that are just littered throughout this book. And it's a discombobulating effect. And that affects the puzzle mystery. It affects everything, but you're absolutely right that it affects the puzzle mystery. My knee jerk was to give this a 2 out of 10, which is really low. The only other time we've given a 2 for plot mechanics is The Secret of Chimneys. We've gone as low as 3 a number of other times. How do you feel about it too, Mark?
Oh, no, 2's too low.
I knew you were going to say that.
2's too low. I think it's supposed to be 1973. Ariadne says right at the beginning that it's famous writers of 1973. So it's actually science fiction. She's writing in the future. Although I think Ariadne does also say whatever year it is that we've got to now.
Well, no, I was actually going to make that point. It's her assistant. And she says, wait, what does she say? It's so funny because that's the point at which I was going to talk about that in setting, because it's on page 4. Yeah, I got very nervous on page 4 when there was a reference to the year the action of the story was taking place. And even that reference was not solid. It's Mariah. She's referring to the literary luncheon that Mrs. Oliver's about to attend. And she calls it famous writers of 1973 or whichever year it is we've got to now. I was like, oh my God, they don't even know what year they're living in. Like, what? This is not good. This is not a good start. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know 3? Okay, I'll go with that. I'll look at the ones that you've given a 3 to, and I think I can go along with that.
Destination Unknown, Hickory Dickory Dock. We've done 3. Death Comes at the End. Actually got a 3. Okay, I am actually fine with a 3. I think that's probably actually the better ranking for it. A 2 is a bit harsh. So on plot credibility, I did actually appreciate the acknowledgement that money not coming into play in this mystery was odd, that there's no lucre here. Poirot says money does not come into it. That is what is so interesting. I mean, and that actually too is a sort of curious incident of the dog in the nighttime situation, that there's no money motive here. And it is a convincing loathing motive. I think we can buy that these two twin sisters, one of them was mentally unstable, and that the sister who was killed didn't want to see her surviving sister go to jail and stain the family's reputation, et cetera, et cetera. That of course requires Molly, the good twin, to have lived just long enough to supply her dear husband Alistair with all these instructions as she's dying out on the cliff, which is Christie in true hard to believe thrillerish form. I don't necessarily love that. Maybe we should consider ourselves lucky that she doesn't say anything cryptic like, why didn't they ask Evans? But I think my big issue when it comes to credibility is that we're never really given a convincing reason why Alistair has to kill himself too. I mean, he does say, I must pay with my own life because he is going to kill Dorothea. He's going to do a very bad thing, but isn't he kind of doing it for the sake of his children, who he is now orphaning?
Orphans, yes, I know. Yeah. I did think similar. But I think that he's an older man. He's a ex-military man. I could see that as a thing of honour, that he wouldn't be able to live with himself afterwards. And I have to say, I've completely, within the realms of what you can do in this sort of novel, I completely bought into the idea of the swap, because what I really liked about it was that it doesn't last very long. Like that they initially think they can do this plan, that they initially think that they can live with, the other sister taking the place of her twin. And then it only lasts like 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah. And that actually that's all that the husband can bear. And I really liked that. I thought that was really clever and very believable, that in the immediate aftermath that he would be, doing whatever his dying wife wanted to do, and then could only bear it for this, a month or so. And I really liked that. I thought that was really clever, that I just sort of could buy into that immediacy and then regret afterwards. So I thought that was within, like I say, the realms of what we might expect this type of story to be wanting us to do. There was a reason for that. I found that sort of credible in its world.
I agree with that. And I think she really does dot her I's and cross her T's as to the person who cleans for them not being able to see very well. There are a lot of references to everyone at that house being partially blind and or partially deaf. And most of them, I think, are extraneous and not necessary. But you can tell that Christie was like, okay, I need to make sure that people couldn't see or hear very well, because that's very important for being able to pull off this switcheroo. My only other criticism as to credibility is that we do have in this story yet another male authority figure, that would be Dr. Willoughby, advancing an outlandish theory. This time it has to do with twins. To be accurate about it, it's his father's theory. But there's this notion which gets repeated multiple times that not only do twins have similar personality traits or characteristics, but that their lives advance along similar lines, and the same things, the same events happen to them at the same time in their lives, that there's this parallelism. And Dr. Willoughby mentions it, and Poirot mentions it, and no one really seems to challenge it. And every time I was like, seriously? This is a thing we're trying to pretend actually happens? And that took me out of the story a bit and just felt unnecessary and silly.
I thought that it was a bit of a shame that, I guess, credibility wasn't increased by us perhaps meeting Edward, I think it is, who's the brother that we never actually meet, who's Celia's brother, who actually is quite important to this. And I felt like it was a shame that he wasn't an elephant, a young elephant, or somebody that actually would have sort of cemented that a little bit more, because I think that added credibility, and I'm sure maybe when we come to deductions about the way that this novel treats mental health is problematic, but within the world of what this book is trying to do, then that makes sense, this whole thing that they genuinely feared for Edward. So it's a bit of a shame that we don't get that, because that would have helped shore some of this up, I think.
I agree. I came out just slightly higher on Black credibility. I would have given it a 3. I'm assuming you're higher than that. Where did you fall?
I am higher than that, because of all the problems I have with this book, credibility actually isn't that high.
It's not the most problematic. I will agree with that. It's not the most problematic category.
I mean, you've got Murder on the Links at 6, and God, try and work out actually how that all works. That's Look, you've got The Clocks at 4, and I don't think we're very far away from that.
I could do a 4. I actually think I was a tick low on both of these. I'm happy to be pushed up to a 4. I think that feels right. It should certainly be higher than plot mechanics, no question.
Yeah.
So
okay, lovely.
All right. Well, then let's move on to probably the happiest category in our ranking of this novel, which is series long characters. We've already alluded to the fact that Christie is doing a lot of great work here, especially as to Ariadne Oliver. Sure, the opening is meandering and unnecessary, but Mrs. Oliver's internal monologue is always entertaining. I thought especially at the literary luncheon, and there were a few moments that were legitimately funny. When Mrs. Burton Cox asks Mrs. Oliver to investigate the Ravenscroft's death on her behalf, she acknowledges, "It's an extraordinary thing to ask anyone. I couldn't very well go and ask a stranger, but I don't feel you are a stranger, dear Mrs. Oliver." "I wish you did," Mrs. Oliver thinks in response. And I chuckled when I read that. I liked that we got a touch of the old-fashioned domesticity from Christie's childhood when Mrs. Oliver likens her old secretary, her previous assistant, to the great big Victorian reference book, Inquire Within Upon Everything, which was a sort of domestic encyclopedia. And that's actually the same book that holds the crucial codicil to Mrs. Llewellyn Smith's will and Halloween party. So I think that's a rather touching example of Christie grasping onto objects from the distant past that clearly gave her comfort. The fact that that book appears in both Halloween Party and Elephants Can Remember. Now, I think that we've spent as much time as we have with both Christie as a writer and even Mrs. Oliver as a character, I find the commonalities between the two of them very charming. And a few things I particularly appreciated in this novel. I loved when Christie actually had Mrs. Oliver use an exercise book to make notes. She writes, taking a new exercise book from the pile she kept on a small table by her desk, she entered various dates, possible addresses and names, looked up one or two more things in the telephone book, and then proceeded to ring up Monsieur Hercule Poirot. And we know that she kept a pile of exercise books on the small table by her desk, and that's exactly how she actually wrote her novels. And this is one of the rare moments, I think, in that investigatory process as she goes elephant to elephant that is charming and entertaining. And then Mrs. Oliver talks about being in a sort of pensionnat in Paris with Molly Preston Gray. That would be Molly Ravenscroft when she got married. And that was very much Christie's experience, which Catherine and I got into in our All About Opera episode. And that was a rare flash of humor as well when Mrs. Oliver joked, people used to send girls to Paris then to be finished. That sounds more like an introduction to a cemetery than an introduction into society. We do have some flashes of humor in this rather grumpy book. There aren't as many of them, I think, as we get in some of the earlier novels. But I found Mrs. Oliver certainly to be a charming series character.
Absolutely. She is such the star of this book.
Yeah.
Slightly to the detriment of Poirot, actually. But it's just so obvious that she's talking about exactly what Agatha Christie felt, especially when she is sort of cornered by Mrs. Burton Cox, which I thought was quite interesting, and we'll talk about it when we come to book-specific characters. But Mrs. Oliver is much more down on Mrs. Burton Cox than she actually is in the book. Like, Mrs. Burton Cox actually doesn't seem that bad when we first meet her. She's just sort of slightly keen. Mm-hmm. And yes, we later learn that she is terrible for all sorts of reasons. But at the time, it's just that Mrs. Oliver's in a bit of a bad mood and that she doesn't want to talk to somebody who's going to be chatting to her because she doesn't like to be cornered at these sorts of events. There's stuff like this. There's mention of an American tour, which she'd done in the 60s with Max, mm-hmm. and even stuff about books or something, or letters being left in a linen cupboard, which she did at Greenway, and for example, and hating speeches. It's absolutely very, very clearly her. I very much enjoyed that. That's what I meant when I said earlier about this is sort of unfiltered time with the mind of Agatha Christie, because she's not worried really about people connecting the dots because it's so obvious. She's obviously not worried about it.
Yeah. No, it's true. And, there is one continuity error Mrs. Oliver makes that might irk many readers. She misremembers White Haven mansions as White Friars mansions. But if we really want to give Christie credit here, we can go all the way back to the Parker Pine short story, The Case of the Discontented Soldier, in which Mrs. Oliver appears, because let's remember, she does appear in 2 of those Parker Pine short stories. That is her first appearance in the Christieverse. And there is a house called White Friars in The Case of the Discontented Soldier. It's the scene of one of the more melodramatic moments in the real-life spy thriller adventure Mrs. Oliver arranges for 2 of Mr. Parker Pine's clients. So, maybe this is just a really, really sly callback on Christie's part. I'm pretty sure it's not, but I always just like to give her all possible credit.
He does say, I mean, but also that's Ariadne Oliver being forgetful, which she is the whole way through, which I'm sure any 82-year-old odd will be forgetful. She does say something like, "Oh, I think it's Whitefriars Mansion," or something like that.
She hedges her bets. I mean, Christie does so much hedging in this book, right? It's like you can imagine her just like talking into her dictaphone, being like, "Oh, let's just say this," because she doesn't want to. And then it's like, couldn't she just have other people look this stuff up for her? Couldn't they just take it upon themselves to look it up?
She really is let down by her editors a lot in this. And it's interesting you say about the dictaphone, because it is, I'm sure, a reason why these later books are, less tight in their plotting than others have been. But just to be completely clear, it wasn't like she would dictate and then that's it. She would then edit them again afterwards. And funnily enough, I was looking at another one, which I won't say for the time being, but from this later era. And there are multiple drafts of it. And one of which is about a third of it is like an old typescript. A third of it also is seems to be a newer typescript. And then maybe I guess the last third is a lot of handwritten stuff, notes and actual sort of pages full that she's handwritten out. And this is one of the later books. So she was still in this era able to do quite substantial editing, but her health was very variable. And so I guess, maybe she was well enough to do it for another and not for this. But it wasn't the case that she just, that was the final thing anyone saw of it. But it's funny when I write things and they come back with loads of comments of like, you say this, but there seems to be slightly contradicted later when you mention this and all this. Mm-hmm. And I often think when I get that, I wish somebody had done that for these later books, because I think that they were just edited very, very quickly. That there could be a Christie for Christmas.
So there could be a Christie for Christmas, which they knew would sell no matter what the quality really was. Although, we do know that she varied in her response to edits, suggestions, various communications. Sometimes I think she could be quite amenable, other times not. So I wonder if sometimes some of these edits, which might have been put before her, if she had been more consistent about accepting them, just weren't, because they were worried about the response they would get. Who knows? But whatever is the case, I think it's just a shame that they didn't happen, because the books would have been stronger as a result. But that is a good reminder. I mean, of course, it's not like she was just dictating into this cylinder and then her typist just typed it up and that was it. But I think starting off from the point of the dictaphone rambling, it allowed her to be more meandering even in the finished product than I think if she had been younger and typing from the get-go, or, being in the written medium from the get-go. But of course, yeah, she did put a lot of work on the page into even these later books. The last thing I want to say about Mrs. Oliver is that she references having a husband. I mean, of course, she is Mrs. Oliver. She says, "I married and went somewhere," early on in the book. And that was a rare enough reference to lead me to wonder, as I was reading, where is Mr. Oliver? And fortunately, we're supplied with an answer about 30 pages later by Mrs. Matcham. That's the woman who worked as a nanny, who seems very old and seems to have known Miss Ariadne from back when she was a girl. They're catching up, and Mrs. Matcham says, "Got a husband now? Oh, now I remember. He's dead years ago, isn't he?" So I suppose this whole time Mrs. Oliver has been a widow. That seems to be the case. I completely agree with you, Mark, that I think she gives a lot of space to Mrs. Oliver to the detriment of Poirot. Let's be honest, this is not a great Poirot novel. I don't think he has that strong of a presence here. We're getting very awkward at this point as to his age. Even David Suchet admits in Poirot and Me that if Poirot was 60 at The Mysterious Affair of Styles, which is about as young as he possibly could have been, he would be 112 at this point. No need to assume time works the same way in the Poirot verse as it does in our world, but there's no question that it's just getting awkward. And then this is just a curiosity I wanted to point out. There's a bit of reminiscing that happens among the inspectors Garraway and Spence and Poirot as to previous cases of Poirot's. There's a lot of reminiscing about Five Little Pigs in multiple places, but Halloween Party is also mentioned, as is Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And when they are mentioned, we actually have footnotes at the bottom of the page that tell us which case they're referencing. It's almost as though Christie is reminding herself of what these cases are, but I have to assume she wanted those footnotes in there. We never get anything like that in any other book, do we?
No, I don't think so. I thought I'd noticed them and thought that it was a little bit odd. It made me think that the publisher was fed up with people writing to them and saying, where can I get this book? Because honestly, half of the correspondence that Agatha Christie seems to be replying to in the 60s in particular, people saying, where can I get a list of your books? So it made me wonder, really, if it was that as much as anything. Maybe I'm a cynic.
But yeah, I mean, we just don't get that many good Poirot moments. There's an interaction between him and Celia Ravenscroft where she doubtfully says she's heard of Poirot. And then this is what Christie writes. Hercule Poirot stopped himself with a slight effort from saying firmly, most people have heard of me. It was not quite as true as it used to be because many people who had heard of Hercule Poirot and known him were now reposing with suitable memorial stones over them in churchyards. So she's aware that he has aged out of the world, and that's a little sad. Before we rank this category, we've already mentioned that Superintendent Spence is here. This is officially his fourth appearance, believe it or not. He was in Taken at the Flood, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, Halloween Party, and now this novel. And Mr. Goby, who we've also referenced in our discussion, he makes a late and, as per usual, convenient appearance. And this is his fifth appearance. He appears in The Mystery of the Blue Train, After the Funeral, Third Girl, and Halloween Party. And finally, there is a blink and you miss it appearance by one Miss Felicity Lemon. She's at the top of chapter 10. I believe she gets just one line of dialogue, which is something to do with the zoological gardens. She's asking about a letter from Desmond Burton Cox, which references Mrs. Oliver's elephants. And it bugs me that Poirot will never loop Miss Lemon in on his cases. And it makes me sad that Pauline Moran did not appear in the Suchet adaptation. But she would make a triumphant return in the Big Four in that final season. So, you know, this is not a superlative category when we're comparing it to all of the other Christie novels, but I think it's by far the best category within this novel. I was going to give it a 5. Where do you fall, Mark?
Well, knowing that I'm going to be quite down on the next category, I again maybe would knock it up a mark, because I think actually Miss Oliver is just, without her, this book just falls apart completely. She is absolutely pushing you along, and Poirot is fine. He's a little bit thinner in terms of characterization than he is at his peak. His sort of Belgian eccentricities are very much dialed down. His English seems to have improved quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, Mr. Goby is probably my least favourite character in the whole canon, because I sort of like groan, because he's such a cheat to bring in this investigator who can just sort of find whatever it is that you particularly need for him to find. And I appreciate that, you know, it's no different to a character running off to Somerset House or whatever and suddenly coming back with exactly what they need. But it does irritate me a little bit that we don't get some really good detection for things often when Goby's around. Yeah, maybe 6.
I will begrudgingly move up a tick to 6. I think if I ever have to revisit this category, that's an easy one to knock back down to 5 if need be. But I am happy to be generous. And
that is far and away the best category, I'd say. So don't worry yourself too much, Kemper, if you think that I'm going to be starting to throw out 10s or anything as we go through.
All right. Well, yeah, let's talk about a much less happy category, which is book-specific characters. I'll start off, I think, as positively as I can. Christie biographer Laura Thompson actually sees something of Charlotte Carlo Fisher in Zélie, who is the loyal governess / companion character, and perhaps most importantly, a keeper of secrets for the Ravenscroft family. You know, Laura Thompson writes that Carlo was that staunch young woman who had stood by and kept silence about the disappearance and everything else in Christie's life until the day she died, just 2 months after Agatha, at the little house in Eastbourne to which she had retired, having confessed to her niece that her heart had troubled her since the death of her former, much-loved employer. That's Carlo, and I love the idea that Christie was perhaps thinking about Carlo when she wrote both Zélie and Maddie, who's the other governess character. And I think we get a bit of Christie's adulation of female teachers in her characterization of these two. And here's a quote from the book. It's mainly about Zélie. He had been impressed by Mademoiselle Roussel. That would be Maddie. He was impressed also by the woman who stood waiting to receive him. She was not so formidable. She was much younger, at least 10 years younger, he thought. And she had a different kind of impressiveness. She was alive, still attractive, eyes that watched you and made their own judgment on you, willing to welcome you, looking with kindliness on those who came her way, but without undue softness. Here is someone, thought Hercule Poirot, very remarkable. That's a good description. And, Christie loves her teachers, especially her female teachers. And I love her for that. The name Fallowfield actually comes up in this book. It's the subsequent owner of the house where the Ravenscrofts lived and where they died. And that reminded me of Nemesis, of course, because that was Miss Temple's school. I feel like Christie probably just had that word on the brain. And then last thing about these two teachers, Maddie also reminded me of Marie Siget, the young French-speaking assistant fitter of dresses that Christie's mother snapped up as a governess when she was quite young. This is when the family were staying abroad in Pau. They were saving money by letting Ashfield, and Agatha needed to learn French. So her mother, Clara, came across this seemingly well-tempered young woman who seemed bright, and she became a part of the family, and it worked very well. Christie loved her, and she talked about being able to close her eyes when she was writing her autobiography and see her face. And I have to imagine she was thinking about her as well as Carlo. And I think those might be two of the best characters in the book. And it's sad that they only appear at the end, because otherwise, I just think we're subjected to a series of quite honestly boring interviews between Mrs. Oliver and the various elephants from her past. The middle part of this book, the investigative part, reminded me of the rather dreary and plodding investigation from House to House in The Clocks, or even of Tuppence's meanderings and By the Pricking of My Thumbs. It's just subpar. And I couldn't tell you much that would distinguish the Honorable Julia Carstairs from Mrs. Matcham, from Mrs. Buckle, from Mrs. Rosentell. It's just a parade of names.
Well, when we're introduced to the Honourable Julie Carstairs, I had to keep going back and check to see whether she'd actually been introduced properly, because I was like, why are we going to this woman? And she is sort of, I mean, but it's really significant, I think, that we just sort of seem to jump from sort of person to person. And I think part of the problem with the characterization in this book is that it's extremely dialogue heavy, and that actually the sort of more descriptive passages, perhaps the more evocative stuff, is almost non-existent. And I was just looking something up because I'd made a note. Chapter 13, Mrs. Burton Cox, opens with, "Well," said Mrs. Oliver, she returned to the room after seeing Celia to the door. We just had a Celia chapter. "What do you think of her? She is a personality," said Poirot, "an interesting girl." I put a note back to it to go, what is she? Oh, really? She seems really boring. I don't know where this idea that she's particularly interesting has come from. And that indeed does follow on from, in my edition, I think 5 full pages that is entirely dialogue, except for the odd he said, she said, which is quite extraordinary, really.
Mark, I literally had this note written down. You can tell that Christie wants us to be impressed by Celia Ravenscroft, but I wasn't much impressed. And I was actually going to read out one of the rare bits of narrative description that we get in chapter 4, which is titled Celia. And this is how that chapter opens. "A tall girl was standing on the mat outside. Just for a moment, Mrs. Oliver was startled looking at her. So this was Celia. The impression of vitality and of life was really very strong. Mrs. Oliver had the feeling which one does not often get. Here, she thought, was someone who meant something. Aggressive, perhaps, could be difficult, could be almost dangerous, perhaps. One of those girls who had a mission in life, who was dedicated to violence, perhaps, who went in for causes, but interesting, definitely interesting." It's like, she's just like, she's really interesting. I really promise she's very, very interesting. It's like
overreaching
no,
really a bit there, isn't she? Like, isn't Mrs. Oliver again? It's always this supernatural thing of, wow, you can read minds. Right. Well done, Mrs. Oliver.
I mean, she's trying to make her Carla from Five Little Pigs. And that's where we can really see, I think, the decline in Christie's powers, which isn't necessarily even due to her age. It's just that this book doesn't work as well, because Carla is that character, right? She comes to Poirot and she says, "I want you to investigate my parents. I want you to get to the bottom of it because I want to move on with my life." And there is a true vitality that we are shown rather than told when it comes to Carla in Five Little Pigs. And it's just not here. And it's here even less for being told about it rather than shown it. Celia just does not really work as a character. Same, I would say, with Desmond. And then also Mrs. Burton Cox. And, we'll get to this in the Stuck in His Time category, but we're supposed to loathe her, like you said. And yet I mainly felt bad for her due to all the adoptive mother shade that Christie throws her way, which does not seem warranted to me reading from 2022. And I totally agree with you that in that scene when she confronts Mrs. Oliver, it's not as bad as you can tell Christie thinks it is. And it was interesting in the Suchet adaptation, they did make her much more odious and loathsome. She sort of physically confronts Zoe Wanamaker as Mrs. Oliver, and she invades her personal space, and it is unpleasant, and you need that. And I believe it's Greta Scacchi, actually, who plays her, and she does a very good job, but you don't get that in the text.
No, not at all. And there's a bit of sort of shoring up of that character towards the end. But yeah, she's somebody who you want to be a really memorable person. Like there should be a way at the beginning that you really, feel strongly about Mrs. Burton Cox. But I've got to say, until Ariadne Oliver keeps going on about how awful she is, I hadn't thought that of her, to be honest. I mean, it's a bit annoying, but people are.
Yeah.
That's what happens in the world, unfortunately.
No, I totally agree. And I would say the other point I want to make about the characters in the book, I think you can see most clearly when it comes to Molly or Margaret Ravenscroft and her husband, Alistair, these are our two victims, right? So in a way, they're the centerpiece of the whole plot. And yet they barely make an appearance on the page because they're dead and they've been dead for years. And there's just a massive filter between them and the reader. And it feels like a thick filter, and it feels clogged by the various reminiscences of these elephants. And yet Christie has done this before and done it so well. And she's made so much of that filter, and it hasn't been clogged. It's actually been able to filter such interesting insights, I think, into who these people are, because that's what she does with Caroline Crail, with Carla's mother in Five Little Pigs. That's even what she does with Mary Gerard in Sad Cypress. I love how she manages to evoke Mary Gerard, who does not really make much of an appearance herself on the page. No. And she harnesses this power from the fact that we only get secondhand accounts of these people. She makes them come alive in those earlier books. And she's just not up to the task here. I mean, the Ravenscrofts are dead and lifeless. I think in every way, two characters can be dead and lifeless in a book. And you can really say the same about Dorothea Jarrow, née Preston Gray, the murderous twin, the quote unquote bad twin or evil twin. She's supposed to be our big villain. And she also, I think, fails to assert her presence in the same way as Molly and Alistair do. And that's really a shame. Although, by the way, did you notice on the gravestone that she died on the 15th of September, Christie's birthday?
That was interesting. Oh, yeah. Good catch. Well done. I was just so thrilled to see a year.
To see a date. To see the year, yeah. But yeah, I mean, honestly, other than Maddie and Zelly, I just don't think these characters are working. I think we have to go pretty low in this category.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was looking at, 2. I'd be happy with a 2.
I think a 2 is appropriate. I think this is the category that's really, really not working. So we are in agreement on that one. Let's give it a 2. And then let's move along to setting and tone, which as per usual is a little bit of our catch-all category, but it's where we can, I think, consider readability. This is a depressing thing to say, but I think in some ways the most interesting thing about this book is its failure. It's the way that it can be used by the likes of Ian Lancashire and Graham Hurst to prove perhaps that Christie's faculties were declining and that she'd fallen from the height she'd once attained. So I think when it comes to setting and tone that this is going to be pretty low as well. I would give it an extremely low score because I think this is a category that often gets a pretty decent, if not high score, because Christie's books, for the most part, even if the puzzle is not working, even if the characters are a bit weak, it's usually quite readable. And this isn't unreadable. There actually are Christie's that are harder to read. I wasn't miserable while I was reading this book, but I was frustrated. I did feel frustrated, and the woolliness or fogginess or whatever you want to call it, I think really does affect the read and not in a good way. I also really could never see any of the various houses Mrs. Oliver visits. I mean, that is part of the discombobulation, I think, of the Honorable Julia Carstairs. There's no sense of difference between her and really the humble abode of Mrs. Buckle, the cleaner. They're just two names from which Mrs. Oliver extracts not very useful information over the course of a few chatty pages. That's really all that can be said. So this is not a book that I think does all that well on setting. I will say that there were a few references placing the book squarely in the 70s that I enjoyed. Mrs. Oliver goes to a well-appointed chemist shop where she takes a look at the well-displayed aids to beauty as imagined by Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, Max Factor, and other benefit providers for women's lives. And then interestingly, Christie just comes out and uses the word abortion late in the book. This is when Dr. Willoughby is giving us the backstory of Dorothea Jarrow. she certainly never would have done that in the 20s, 30s, 40s, or I think even 50s or perhaps 60s. You know, the laws as to abortion had changed by this point. And it's just a forthright reference that startled me, not in a bad way, but just, you know, it's one of those moments where you realize that she did change with the times and that she is a writer, even in her 80s at this late date, who is responding to, I think, the shifting social customs around her. So I appreciated that. And then there's a reference to the UNO or UNESCO when Poirot says he's going to Geneva. And we have, you know, a few of the usual Christie crotchety references to young people that we've gotten so many times before. I don't think we need to go into any of them in particular, except that there's one instance where it's the Honorable Julia Carstairs. She's talking about going to a wedding, or actually she's talking about one of her friends who went to a wedding. And the friend said, the bridegroom was dressed in some sort of quilted white satin and ruffles at his neck, made of Valencian lace, I believe. Most peculiar. And the girl was wearing a very peculiar trouser suit, also white, but it was stamped with green shamrocks all over. If I'd been a clergyman, I'd have refused to marry them. This is just another 70s moment. The shamrocks, I think, on the trouser suit of the bride is just a detail there that really does place this in 1972. So, you know, I do appreciate those touches, but I think this is a weak book as to setting.
Yeah, it's very flat. You know, tonally as well. There's no sort of great excitement or no pace to it either. Things like the previous lives in Malaya and all of this sort of stuff that never really comes to life. And I think for setting and tone, the big thing that I've got the biggest problem with is that in, say, Five Little Pigs, and maybe it's unfair to compare everything against Five Little Pigs, but it feels important. Like, it feels like this is significant. We need to know what happened here. And I couldn't get over the fact that reading all the way through this book, nobody seemed to care. Like, nobody seemed to talk as if it was at all extraordinary that these two people had been shot atop a cliff, who they'd known for years. And that includes Mrs. Oliver, who's talking, oh, well, I was in America at the time. I mean, can you imagine coming home? And also I was like, she's her godparent. Shouldn't she have said, oh, well, I've got to take some sort of parental type responsibility here now because, you know, both your parents are dead. That's sort of what a godparent is for. So I found that absolute lack of urgency and lack of importance to be so difficult. And I felt that more than anything else was what really hampered this book for me, was that who cares? No one in the book seems to particularly, except for Mrs. Burton Cox. And even then we don't really understand until later on why that might be. That for me was a really big issue when I was reading this.
You know, that is an excellent point. I never even thought about that, but you're absolutely right. That so rings true for me as you're saying it. And I think it made me think immediately of, I didn't think I'd be referencing this book. In comparison, They Do It With Mirrors, because They Do It With Mirrors involves Miss Marple and her relationship with her old school friends. I mean, that is of the level of the same relationship. Not only is Mrs. Oliver the godparent to Molly's child, but they went to school together, right? They went to school abroad together in France. Miss Marple went to school abroad with Carrie Louise. I will always remember her name. Like, that's how important that character is within the Marpleverse, right? And her sister Ruth. And you can feel how much Miss Marple cares about them. And the idea that Carrie Louise might be in danger, because Miss Marple cares and because Christie cares as her creator, you care immediately. And that book is by no means perfect. And then, of course, Five Little Pigs, it's like these people are so alive and like, what did happen? And why did this family fall apart? And like, God, this is such a disaster. And it's so true. There's no sense of that here. And there really should be, because this was an old friend of Mrs. Oliver's and she was a godparent, and you could have been made to care just as much as you were in those earlier books. And then the story would have come alive, but it just doesn't. It's just flat. Because of that, it just doesn't work as well. It's working at about, 20 to 30% what it would be otherwise, I think, because that emotional verve is not there. And it's something that Christie really does have, because again, she's not about the pure mechanics. She really does make you care in the best Christies about these people and what happened to them. And this one does really feel very mechanical. And then unfortunately, the mechanics aren't even that impressive. So yeah, that is a really excellent point, Mark. And we've talked obviously about the fact that it's meandering and that there are awkward transitions and it's overly chatty and not with particularly good dialogue in many moments, even though Christie at her height was such an excellent creator of dialogue. The only other thing I want to mention is that I believe there was another reference to a murderous lesbian pair in this book, which we also had in Nemesis. Dr. Willoughby, it's when Dr. Willoughby is pontificating about twins and just people being mentally ill. And we'll talk a little bit about that in our next category and Stuck in Its Time. But he mentions these two women and how one of them just kills the other one and how it was unexpected and very sad. And it felt like another throwaway reference to two women who are living together and one of them killed the other. And we talked about it in the Nemesis episode, Jamie and I, and it didn't seem homophobic at the time, but I raised an eyebrow here because I was like, is this the second consecutive reference to a murderous lesbian pair? I also don't think it's really all that significant, but I noted it, so I wanted to mention it in my review, and perhaps I'm reading too much into it and it's not even really there.
Yeah, I didn't really pick up on that. That's interesting. I think that we can probably ascribe a lot of this to ideas getting lodged in the brain.
Yeah, that's the thing. She's just so kind of fixated on things because the gears aren't moving perhaps as quickly as they were. So there's a little bit of stasis. Where do you come down on setting and tone?
Yeah, really low. So it's got to be the lowest of any of her books to this point, I would say, which would give it a sort of a 2, I guess. I don't know. Is that really mean? I think that, as much as there is to enjoy in this, if you're actually talking about how good it is at setting and tone and the readability of it, it's not really there, is it?
Wow, a 2 mark. Well, I wasn't even going to go that low. I was going to give it a 3, but I actually think a 3 is as low as we've ever gone.
Well, I'm saying these, I should say, like, for people listening, if you think I'm being really harsh, I'm giving all of my responses because I've got the grid in front of me, what you've given before. So every time we're going through a category, I'm reading what marks you've given other books.
You were an A+ student of All About Agatha. I would often have the grid in front of me. Catherine didn't even ever have the grid. She actually preferred not to so that she could be more freeform about it. But I appreciate that. I think we've only given a 3 in setting and tone to The Murder on the Links, which might actually be a little harsh.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's always been higher. I mean, I would be okay with a 3, though.
Okay, let's go 3.
Okay. And then let's move on to depictions stuck in their time. So again, just to be clear, the issues we're discussing here, we're not saying that they are stuck in time. It's actually quite the opposite. I think these are issues that people will grapple with forever and have grappled with forever, but the way that Christie handles them in the book might jar in a way that she didn't intend and thereby mar the read of the mystery. So for me, there really are 2 issues. And I think you already identified the treatment of mental illness, Mark. And I think I'll let you handle that one because I focused a lot more on the adoptive mother issue because that was the one that just really rubbed me the wrong way and that I found inescapable as I was reading the book. We find out about midway through that the supposedly odious Mrs. Burton Cox is not Desmond's biological mother, that she adopted him. And this just leads to a number of distressing comments. Desmond says, she's not really my mother. I'm adopted. She had a son, a little boy who died, and then she wanted to adopt a child, so I was adopted and she brought me up as her son. She always speaks of me as her son and thinks of me as her son, but I'm not really. We're not a bit alike. We don't look at things the same way. And Poirot repeats this later without any sort of refutation or disapproval. He refers to Desmond as the son who is not her son. And when Mrs. Oliver asks him what he means, he replies, he is an adopted son, a son she adopted because her own son died. Then Celia joins the party. She says, you see, what business is it really of hers? Why should she come worrying Mrs. Oliver here, trying to make Mrs. Oliver ask me questions, find out things? She's not his own mother. And Celia goes on to say that Desmond doesn't care for Mrs. Burton Cox. She doesn't think Mrs. Burton Cox really cares for him. The way that their relationship is treated in the book is that there's just nothing real about it, that it's not a valid parent-child relationship. And we've talked about this many times before. This isn't even so much a depiction stuck in its time. It's just a weird issue that Christie had vis-a-vis adoption. And I think we can lay the blame partially on the fact that her mother was adopted by her own aunt, and that Christie's own biological grandmother essentially gave her up because she was in straitened circumstances as to finances, and that's something that Christie's own mother never really got over, and perhaps Christie just absorbed that disinclination for adoption. And we can see that in the adoptive relationships that she fictionalizes in so many of her books. So many of her books. And there was one moment when Poirot refers to the fact that Mrs. Burton Cox spends money on Desmond. Poirot says she spent money on him, schooling and on clothes and on all sorts of different things. And at that point, I wrote in my margin, shades of Rachel Argyle, because we're getting into Ordeal by Innocence territory there. That's the book where we really see Christie's weirdness as to adoption. And it just is unpleasant. Catherine and I talked about that, I think, in our Ordeal by Innocence episode. But, you know, I am a gay man. I have a husband. We have children. I don't need to get into exactly how we had children, but obviously it wasn't, you know, ye old traditional situation. And I can speak from experience when I say that parents who aren't biologically related to their children love them just as much. And that is not something that I think should have been controversial or doubted in 1972 or even 1942, and certainly not in 2022. So it's just really hard for me, I think personally, to get over that in this book. And it's just there over and over. So I had a big issue with that.
Yeah, and I identified that as well, especially, well, for everything you said, I'm not going to repeat it all, but basically several things that you noticed are things that I noticed as well. So that's off. In terms of the sort of mental health stuff, although certainly of its time, I didn't have a sort of problem with the terminology that we wouldn't use now. Lots of mental cases being mentioned, for example. I can sort of live with that. It's 1972. That's standard terminology at that point for all the problems that it's sort of inherent. My problem with that actually was much more that there was this sense in it that once you're mad forever. You know, you can't be trusted. And there's no way that you could possibly be rehabilitated or made well again, because look, they trusted her and she went off and tried to kill children again. So this really sort of vagueness about her being mad or crazy or however they want to talk about it in some non-specific way, that was, I felt, much more problematic than some of the terminology, which certainly is dated. It was just this, even for 1972, that's not great to make it sound like, oh, well, you're either sane or you're crazy, and that's sort of how it works, and you're stuck with one or the other. I found that quite difficult. I don't know how you felt about it, Kemper.
I agree. There's a conflation, I think, of mental disability with inferior character or badness of character, and that's uncomfortable. And I think what it also
conflation. Sorry, I thought you said mental disability, mental health, like this whole idea about that she'd always been wrong in some way, but then they thought she was cured, and it's so strange the way that it can't make its mind up about actually what they're saying about her. Are they saying that she's someone who has struggled with mental health issues that, I don't know, somehow makes her go and try to hack children? Absolutely bizarre. Or are we supposed to believe that, there is something more fundamental here that's been prompted? But this conflation of everything, really, to just sort of put a big, stamp, like a Homer Simpson type stamp, and say sane or insane, that is what you'll have and you'll be stuck with forever. It's really, really troubling.
I think it comes down to ableism. And we, I think Catherine and I didn't talk about that enough as we were reviewing some of the earlier novels, but it's something that comes up a lot more in the later ones. And it will come up a lot actually in Curtain, which we haven't yet gotten to. But the idea that any sort of difference from the norm as to mental health means that you're dangerous and that you need to be separated. It's not as baldly stated as that, because nothing is baldly stated in this book, because it's all hedged or couched in confusion and conflicting statements, but it certainly is never clarified either. And I think you could read this book and come away with the idea that, well, Dorothea Jarrow was a dangerous person and a quote unquote menace to society because of her mental health issues. And that could be a true statement, but it's the way it's conveyed. It's almost conveyed as a judgment of her character as opposed to a judgment of her actions per se. And I think the fuzziness around that could be troubling for a reader, probably more so in 2022, because I think that our views on mental health have changed actually pretty significantly from 1972. So I think it was probably less troubling for a reader back then, but probably even a little so then. It's just, it's not sensitively handled. That's for sure.
2 deductions?
Yes, 2 deductions. I think that is fair. This is not a case where we're spending the book clutching our pearls from beginning to end, but it definitely has some issues. So 2 deductions makes a lot of sense. All right, Mark, we are at the best part of the episode, which is tallying up the score for the novel we have just picked apart. So for Elephants Can Remember, here is where we are. We have a 3 + 4 + 6 + 2 + 3 - 2 for a grand total of 16 points, putting Elephants Can Remember in a tie, Mark, for last place, which means we now have 4 novels with a score of 16. We've got, in descending order, Hickory Dickory Dock, The Big Four, and The Secret of Chimneys. And now we have to slot Elephants Can Remember in there. Where would you put it?
Right. So, just want to settle in. Definitely above Secret of Chimneys.
Yep.
Now, my issue is that I think The Big Four is better than Hickory Dickory Dock. So I'm now having to think about where I am with both of these. I can't put this above The Big Four, but Hickory Dickory Dock is probably my least favourite Agatha Christie. But yeah, so I guess around there. I mean, you'll be fiddling with these later anyway, won't you, Kemper? What's your feeling?
As many listeners know, I have a lot of affection for The Big Four, actually, and I agree with you. I think I would probably flip The Big Four and Hickory Dickory Dock at this point. Just the more time that goes by, the more affectionately I feel about The Big Four. That's probably because the distance between my read and the present day.
I think also, but the problem is that you read it as a novel, and it's just not to be read as a novel. I know that's obviously how it's sold and how you have it now, but you dip into it as a collection of short stories, and it's not her best collection by any stretch of the imagination. But 2 or 3 of them are really excellent.
Are really fun. I know it's those early the sketch like Poirot's, right? Where you're just like, oh, that was, just a great time. I agree. So I'll probably at some point flip those, but I agree that it's better than The Secret of Chimneys. I think The Secret of Chimneys should remain in dead last. I would probably put it second to last.
Okay. Yeah, that's this is the thing, is that I was thinking when I was going into this that I have to play fair. I have to think about what you and Catherine have done all the way through and not come in and just be like, well, there's loads that I like in this, which there is. And so therefore, let's be really generous to it, because that's unfair then to the other ones. So yeah, realistically, we can say honestly that I actually did enjoy reading this book, and it is the second to last Agatha Christie book to date so far. So, if that doesn't show her genius, I don't know what does.
Exactly. I mean, there's probably no more commendable statement that you could make about an author, right? That her second to worst book, we haven't covered Posthumous of Fate yet, but her current second to worst book was an enjoyable read. Well, Mark, thank you so much for doing this. This was as delightful as I knew it was going to be, if not more. I so appreciate you deep diving with me and figuring out where Elephants Can Remember should go. And I think we absolutely landed on the right spot.
Thank you, Kemper. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure. Any excuse to talk about Agatha Christie, and I'm there, basically.
Thanks, Mark. Well, that is Elephants Can Remember. Thank you again to my stupendous co-host, Dr. Mark Aldridge. For our next episode, I will actually be interviewing another scholar of not just Christie, but literary theory in general and feminist theory in particular. That would be Alison Light, who wrote a book that came out in 1991 titled Forever England, Femininity, Literature, and Conservatism Between the Wars. And one of the chapters therein is all about Agatha Christie. This was actually a critical analysis that really changed the way that people thought about Christie. Alison Light is a leading light, dare I say, in literary criticism, and she is brilliant. And her chapter on Christie in that book, Forever England, is brilliant. And we had so much to discuss, and I cannot wait to share that conversation with you. And then, of course, a bit in the future, our next novel episode will be Postern of Fate. As I know some of you think of it, the dreaded Postern of Fate, but I am not dreading it because I am thrilled to inform you that my co-host for that episode will be none other than Caroline Crampton. who has quite a bit of hosting experience herself. She, of course, is the host, producer, creator, and mastermind behind the fabulous mystery-themed podcast, She Done It. I know that many of you listen to her. We have lots of crossover in terms of our audience. Catherine and I were able to make an appearance on She Done It a while back, and we had been very much planning for Caroline to come onto our show. I, of course, wish that Caroline could be coming on to have a conversation with Catherine and me, but I am thrilled nonetheless that she has agreed to co-host Postern of Fate in particular, which is no small undertaking, as I think many of you know. So very much looking forward to that. And in the meantime, of course, if you want any bonus content, you can head on over to the podcast's Patreon site. I have included a link in the notes for this episode, but I'll also give you the URL here. It's www.patreon.com, patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And please do take a moment to give the show a rating and or a review. I love reading them. It helps other people find this crazy little Christie-addled corner of the podcast universe. And it makes me happy for as many of us as possible to find each other. And on that note, I will see you all next time. Bye.
If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.